I opened my eyes and immediately regretted it, because the sun was trying to murder me personally. My throat felt like I'd gargled a campfire. My head weighed roughly a truck. I reached for the glass of water that's supposed to live on my nightstand, the one I set out every single night, and my hand hit something that went ding-a-ling-ling. A bell. A little brass bell. I don't own a bell. I'm a grad student. I own instant noodles and regret. So I forced my eyes the rest of the way open, and that's when the day got weird. The room was the kind of rich that makes you check your own pulse. Crystal chandelier the size of a small car, murals on the walls, actual muskets and swords in gold frames like somebody decorated their bedroom out of a military museum gift shop. I looked down, and the sheets under my hands were so soft I was pretty sure you could wring water out of them. Rococo, my brain supplied helpfully. You saw this style on that trip to Europe. Great. Very helpful. Deeply unhelpful. Then the door slammed open and a blonde man in a military uniform came in like the building was on fire and shouted, "Thank God, Otto, you're finally awake. We were all going crazy, Otto." My name is Li Wei. I opened my mouth to say that, and then I noticed two things at once. One, he was speaking German. Two, everybody else in the room was also speaking German. I went to bed a Chinese grad student in the 21st century and woke up surrounded by a room full of anxious blonde people who wanted to know how I was feeling. Cool. Very cool. Love that for me. And then the headache hit. Not a headache. A home invasion. A whole life kicked the door in and moved into my skull. Names, faces, 40 years of somebody else's memories dumped in at once. I grabbed my head, and when the flood settled, I knew exactly who the man in the doorway was. Archduke Maximilian, last great general of the Austrian Empire, and I knew who I was supposed to be. "Bring me a mirror," I said, "just to be sure. You always want to be sure." They brought me a mirror, because apparently when the emperor asks for a mirror, you sprint. And there it was. Blonde hair, aquamarine eyes, a nose you could ski down. Not one part of it mine. My heart did something I can only describe as a full stop. I transmigrated. I actually transmigrated into a body. Into a specific body. And here is the part where the universe decided to really twist the knife. I knew this body. As a lifelong military and history nerd, I knew exactly whose face was staring back at me out of that mirror, and I knew what was coming for him, minute by minute, like a horror movie I'd already seen. I was Otto Friedrich I, Emperor of Austria, and his life was a tragedy speedrun. Let me give you the highlight reel, because I'd read all of it. The one genuinely happy day of this man's life was marrying his gorgeous cousin Alara, and then he buried himself in paperwork and ignored her until she cracked. His finances collapse. He loses a war to Prussia. His brother gets executed in Mexico. In 1889, his only son shoots himself and his mistress at a hunting lodge. In 1898, the wife he never really talked to gets stabbed to death by an anarchist with a file. In 1914, his nephew gets shot in Sarajevo and the whole world catches fire. And in 1916, this poor bearded old man dies alone on a sick bed, whispering for the wife he lost, while his empire is already coming apart at the seams. I woke up as the guy whose entire future is a list of funerals. And the funerals hadn't even started yet, because I'd landed early, June 1st, 1859, the Second Italian War of Independence, which is a fancy history book way of saying, right now, this very minute, France and the Kingdom of Sardinia are handing my army its own teeth. My commander at the front is losing so badly that the King of Sardinia will later suggest they build a monument, not to themselves, to my general, for being that helpful to the enemy. So to recap, new body, new continent, new century, wife, I'm doomed to get murdered. War, I'm currently losing, and a room full of people staring at me waiting for the emperor to say something imperial. I really should change this habit of praying, I said in Otto's voice, doing my best impression of a man who had merely fainted from overwork, and not say, been replaced by a stranger from the future. Because here's the thing they didn't know, the thing nobody in 1859 could possibly know. I hadn't just inherited a doomed man. I'd inherited a doomed man plus a cheat. I knew how every one of those disasters happened. I knew the weapons, the battles, the treaties, the betrayals, all of it, cover to cover. The universe dropped me into the worst seat in Europe and forgot I'd already read the whole book. Fine. New plan. We're going to cancel some funerals. First, though, I had to survive the next 20 minutes without anyone deciding the emperor had lost his mind, which turned out to be its own running joke, but we'll get to that. They wanted to send a telegram to Vienna that I was awake. Alara had been begging to come see me, and every instinct I had screamed no. I could fake being Otto for a general or a doctor. I could not fake it for the woman who'd married him. Not yet. So I agreed to the telegram, dreaded her arrival like a scheduled exam, and cleared the room. Let me be quiet for a while. And then, finally alone in a dead man's bedroom, I did the only thing that made sense. I got up, found a pen, and started writing down names. Because if I was going to save this empire, and more importantly, the handful of people in it I'd decided were mine, I needed to understand exactly how deep the hole was, and it was deep. There was an old joke around here from the Metternich days that the empire stood on 4 armies, an army of standing soldiers, an army of sitting officials, an army of kneeling priests, and an army of spies who were, apparently, everywhere. Cute. The problem was the first army, the one that actually shoots people, was busy getting flattened in Italy, and everyone in Vienna still thought it was one of the best in Europe. It was not. I knew it was not. I'd read the after-action reports 160 years from now. While I was drinking that in, they sent the court doctor to look me over. He listened to my chest with a stethoscope that looked like it had been carved by a hopeful child, declared me perfectly healthy, and advised me to avoid fatigue. I thanked him and got him out of the room fast, because I'd also read what passed for cutting-edge medicine in 1859. Their favorite treatment was bloodletting. Queen Alexandra's husband would eventually get bled to death by doctors just like this one. If I ever got seriously sick here, my plan was to run. Then it was Maximilian's turn, and this is where I started actually working. I poured him a glass of wine, Italian, Valpolicella, which he identified from one sip because apparently everyone in this century is a sommelier, and I asked him for the truth about the war, not the reports. The truth was ugly. My commander at the front, Count Kovacs, was building a defense line on the Sesia River, or claiming to. He'd also lost the Battle of Montebello and reported it up the chain as a glorious victory. Then a small defeat. Then he swore he'd routed the enemy. 3 different stories from one battle. My general wasn't just losing, he was lying about losing, which is the special kind of losing that gets an entire country killed. I set my glass down. Maximilian, take Menstorff's cavalry division to the front tonight. Relieve Kovacs. You will personally command. Maximilian practically levitated. His father was a legendary general, and Maximilian had spent his whole life being handed governorships and diplomatic errands while secretly wanting exactly one thing. A battlefield. I just handed it to him. His heels clicked together so hard I worried about the floor. One more thing, I said. When you find Kovacs, give my chief adjutant, Count Richter, a message from me. Richter, you are relieved of your duties. Maximilian's face fell off. Otto, Richter is your closest friend. He's served the Empire loyally for years. Loyalty? Sure. Richter was loyal the way a leaking pipe is loyal to your ceiling. Here was a man who held the title of military expert, chaired the army committee, meddled in every decision, and had exactly 0 combat experience. He'd feuded with old Marshal von Sternberg, the one competent reformer we'd had, blocked every reform out of spite, gutted the war ministry, and cut the soldiers' pay while bragging that he could buy all the officers he needed for 24 florins a month. He'd personally recommended Kovacs for command. Everything currently on fire in Italy had Richter's fingerprints on the match. And the truly annoying part, the part I couldn't say out loud, was that the biggest fool in this whole disaster was the man whose face I was now wearing. The real Otto had trusted Richter with everything, reviewed his troops in their pretty white uniforms, marching in perfect squares, and felt proud. There's an Austrian saying for it, we have such an excellent army. What did those madmen do? They sent it to fight. Not anymore. Let him reflect on the state of the army he built, I said, and I heard my voice go cold in a way that startled even me. Then I gave Maximilian the real gift. A sheet of paper covered edge to edge in my own handwriting, everything I knew about the French army he was about to face. Their rifles had shorter range than our Lorenz rifles. Good. But the French elites had been tempered in Crimea and North Africa, and what they did best was close in fast and settle it with the bayonet, which would shred our green troops in seconds. So don't stand there in neat lines waiting to die politely. Spread out. Use skirmishers. Use cover. Use the range you've got. Some of their artillery had new rifled cannons that outclassed ours, but they used them the old way, bunched up at the front. A weakness. Hit it. And when in doubt, remember the old Far Eastern saying, keep the men, lose the land, and you keep both. Trade ground for their blood, destroy the army, not the map. Maximilian read it, and I watched a very specific expression crawl across his face. It's an expression I was going to get extremely familiar with over the next few months. It said, how in God's name does the Emperor know the exact caliber and doctrine of the enemy's artillery? Did our intelligence people infiltrate the French army? And underneath that, quieter and more worrying, the Emperor's father had a family history of mental illness. The Habsburgs marry their cousins for sport, and the results are not always structurally sound. Maximilian was standing there wondering, very respectfully, if the shock of the war had cracked his emperor like a dropped egg. I couldn't exactly tell him the truth. Hi Maximilian, I'm from the future. I gathered all this off documentaries and a stack of history books, one of which I was in the middle of writing when I died of overwork. That does not read as sane. That reads as a man who needs a nice quiet room with soft walls. So I let him think whatever he needed to think, and I let him go. He went out into the Venetian night, boarded a fast boat, and vanished toward the front to relieve a drunk and take over a war. I stood at the window and watched him go, and I felt the weight of it land on me properly for the first time. Not the empire. Forget the empire for a second. The people. The wife I hadn't met yet who was going to be murdered. The son who wasn't born yet who was going to put a gun to his head. All of it downstream from this exact week, from whether one man at one river held the line. No pressure. Okay, a lot of pressure. Now, before I tell you how I started climbing out of the hole, let me show you the men who could have thrown me a rope that morning and decided to go back to bed instead, because it matters. Half of winning a war is knowing exactly who is not going to help you. 10 Downing Street, London, same morning. There's a room full of the most powerful men in the British Empire, and there's cigar smoke, and there's tea, and there's a stack of telegrams from Italy that all say the same thing. Austria is losing badly. Their old war secretary, a leathery general named Wellington, reads one out and just sneers. Battle reports can lie, gentlemen. Front lines cannot. And their front line is walking backwards. Their foreign man Cavendish is nervous. He wants Britain to step in and mediate before this whole mess gives birth to some brand new kingdom of Italy that nobody planned for and everybody has to deal with. And then Gladstone, the sharp one with the oiled curls and the Queen's ear, points out the one fact that ends the whole conversation. They can't do anything. This government just lost an election. They're a caretaker cabinet. They don't have the authority to send a regiment or lend a shilling. So the most powerful men in the world look at the fire consuming the middle of Europe, agree it's a terrible shame, and decide the sensible thing is to let the next government deal with it and go back to worrying about India. I learned all this later. At the time, I just knew, from the book I'd already read, that Britain would sit on its hands. And you know what? I filed it under good news. One fewer great power at the table trying to strangle me in my crib. I made myself a small private promise, right there, that by the time the next British government finished forming and looked up from its maps of the Punjab, the table would be so rearranged they wouldn't recognize the room. I keep my private promises. You can ask the King of Sardinia if you can find whatever's left of him. But Britain was tomorrow's problem. That morning's problem was that I still didn't actually understand my own government, so I called the two men who did to lunch. The first was my adjutant, Gustav. Enormous. A blonde wall of a man the soldiers called the Golden Lion King, the kind of person who makes an ordinary doorway look apologetic for being so small. And the second was the one I actually needed, Baron Steiner, my chief of the general staff. Silver hair, eyes like an old eagle that has personally watched a great many things go wrong and would very much prefer not to watch them go wrong again. Steiner had chased the first Louis across Europe as a young man. He'd stood in the smoke at Leipzig. When a man like that sits down across your table, you do not waste his time on the weather, so I didn't. I let him get one spoonful of the soup, and then I said it. I've dismissed Kovacs and Richter. Steiner put the spoon down, and then his face did the most wonderful thing, a kind of heroic, straining effort to look grave and concerned about news that was clearly the best he'd had in a decade. Because he'd spent years watching two well-connected amateurs run the army he loved into a ditch, and here was the boy emperor doing overnight the thing he'd been praying for. He mastered it. He's a professional. He gave me the professional objection. Majesty, changing your commanders on the eve of a battle is one of the oldest mistakes in the entire art of war. I slid a folded paper across the table to him. It was Kovacs's letter of resignation, the one he'd written at the very start of the war before a single shot was fired. Steiner read it, and I watched the professional caution drain right out of his face and get replaced by something much closer to relief. A general who submits his resignation before the fighting even begins is not a man you want holding your western flank against 100,000 Frenchmen. Then I asked the question that made both of them stop chewing entirely. What do the French eat? There was a silence. A very particular kind of silence. The kind two loyal men produce when they are quietly, respectfully recalculating whether their emperor's recent head injury was worse than the doctors let on. But they answered. You answer the emperor. A French soldier, 600 grams of bread, 300 of meat, a day. A Sardinian, a little less meat, a little more bread. And I did the arithmetic for them, out loud. 200,000 Allied soldiers, every single day. That is not an army, gentlemen. That is a city that walks. And a walking city has to be fed from behind it, by rail, out of depots stacked up in the rear. Turin, Genoa, Susa. I let it hang for a second. And maybe Alessandria. Remember that last name. It's going to burn. That was the whole war, sitting right there in a bowl of chowder. But then Gustav gave me the piece of news that told me exactly how rotten the foundation really was. Since 1855, to plug the holes in a treasury that was bankrupt long before I woke up in it, Austria had sold off its own state railways to private investors, and a great many of those investors were French. And now that there was a war on, those French-owned railways all across Austria had, simultaneously and tragically, developed an urgent need for maintenance. The trains weren't running. My army could not move its own supplies through its own country because the tracks under the wheels belonged to the enemy's bankers. Let me say that one again slowly, because it took me a second the first time too. We were at war with France. France's investors owned my railroads, and they had switched them off. My first instinct was warm and human and simple. Send soldiers to every station, seize the lot, hang anyone who complains, as a teaching aid. Steiner's instinct was the same. He wanted the Austrian traitors who'd helped rig the sale strung up as an example to the others. And this is the trap. This is the beautiful, airless trap the whole empire was sealed inside, and I need you to understand it, because everything I do for the next 6 weeks is me trying to pick the lock. We could not seize anything. Austria owed something like 1.25 billion florins. We lived on borrowed money the way a drowning man lives on his next breath. And the iron law of finance in this century is very simple and very cruel. The day a government seizes capitalist assets or cancels its debts is the day no one on earth ever lends it another coin. You do it once, and you starve. And we'd already spent our good name for nothing, which made it worse. A few years back, in the Crimean War, Austria had betrayed its oldest friend, Russia. Mobilized on the Tsar's border, forced him to keep an army pinned in place doing absolutely nothing, helped Russia lose the war, and then asked for a reward and got laughed out of every court in Europe. So now everyone hated us, nobody trusted us, and we still couldn't pay the bill. My predecessor, whoever's handsome face I was now wearing, had the strategic instincts of a man who tips his own canoe over to check whether it floats. So I told them I wasn't going to seize a thing. Heaven forbid. I was simply going to send some soldiers to help operate the railways that had so very sadly stopped operating. Fully staffed, around the clock. Terribly generous of us, really. Purely a maintenance matter, you understand. Steiner almost smiled. I was already learning to treasure the sight. It was like watching a granite cliff decide, against its own better judgment, that it was fond of you. Then I made him walk with me, down a long corridor hung with portraits of dead Venetian doges, because there was a thing I needed him to feel, and not just hear. I stopped in front of one of them, Giovanni Grimani, the doge at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, the day a whole Christian coalition finally broke the Ottoman fleet at sea, and I asked him why that particular dead man mattered to me this particular morning. He didn't even have to think about it. Because Venice could not beat the Turk alone, Majesty. It took a coalition. Exactly. And here was Austria, fighting France alone, while France had Sardinia in her pocket, and Prussia sat on the fence sharpening its own knife, and Russia wouldn't cross the street to spit on me if I were on fire. Every ally the empire had ever owned, we had driven off with our own 2 hands. I had been handed a great power with no friends, no money, and a war it was losing, and told to smile for the painting. And Steiner gave me the only sentence in all of European politics that has ever actually been true, the one I already believed in my bones, but wanted to hear said out loud by a man born into this century. Majesty, only by being strong yourself can you fear no challenge. Concessions buy you nothing. Sophie Teresa learned it the hard way when Frederick took Silesia off her and smiled while he did it. Strength is the one currency on earth that never inflates. Good, I thought. Then we are going to get very, very strong. But first I had to go and actually look at the thing I kept calling my army, because so far I'd only read about it. I had never once met it. Meeting it was an education. They'd laid on a live fire demonstration for me, out where a regiment was drilling under a cheerful, sweating, roughly spherical general named Schneider, a man whose soldiers genuinely liked him, which already put him ahead of 90% of my officer corps. The regiment marched and wheeled, very handsome, all those white parade uniforms moving in neat blocks. And then I did something a little cruel, because I needed the truth, and the truth doesn't come out for a compliment. I leaned over to the officer running the drill and told him calmly that his interpreter had just been shot dead. Killed in action. Carry on. The formation came apart like wet bread, because here is the thing that nobody in Vienna would say out loud about our glorious army. The commands were in German, and the men were not. Poles, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Czechs, Croats, Romanians, a whole continent's worth of languages standing shoulder to shoulder in one square, and the only thing turning an order into an action was a single interpreter per unit, relaying it down the line. Kill that one man, and the entire company goes deaf and blind and stupid on the spot. I had just proven, with a sentence, that you could shatter an Austrian regiment without firing a shot, provided you shot the right translator first. I filed that under things to fix before they get my soldiers slaughtered. Then I took the firing line over myself, because I wanted one honest number that nobody had massaged for a report. I offered a real dinner and 3 full months' pay to any man who could put a ball on the target inside 3 shots. The target stood at 260 meters, 60 men fired. 8 hit, 8 out of 60. In the army that all of Europe and every man in Vienna called one of the finest on the continent. I kept my face perfectly, imperially still, and I thanked them warmly. And then I did the thing that mattered a great deal more than the number. I gave every single man who tried a full month's pay and 30 rounds of ammunition, and I told them to just shoot, for the fun of it, freely. Because they almost never got to. Training in my glorious army was rationed to 5 bullets a month. 5. 60 a year. And the line came alive. 60 grinning soldiers burning powder like it was a saint's day, and somewhere in the crash and smoke a voice yelled, "Long live the Emperor!" And then the whole line was roaring it. And I stood there in the black powder smoke, thick as a wool curtain, and I made a private note that I was going to need smokeless powder, and I was going to need it soon. And I looked at these men who couldn't hit a target at 200 meters, who couldn't understand the orders shouted at them, who were paid less than the fellow who swept the floor of a Vienna factory, and who, in the history I'd read, cover to cover, were going to be marched into the meat grinder at Solferino in about 3 weeks, and lose, and begin the long, slow dying of everything I just decided was mine. Not these ones. I decided it standing right there in the smoke, with my ears ringing. Not these particular men. General Schneider, naturally, tried to resign. Took full responsibility for the marksmanship, offered me his career on a plate, the whole solemn ceremony of it, and I began to notice a pattern in this army that would eventually become one of my favorite running jokes. The instant anything went wrong, an Austrian officer would try to hand me his resignation, as though quitting were itself a kind of solution. I told Schneider no, he was a good officer, his men loved him, and I had extremely specific plans that required him very much employed. Write me a training report by tonight instead. He looked like a man who'd braced himself to jump off a cliff and been handed a sandwich. Then he took the sandwich, saluted, and got to work. While I was learning that my soldiers couldn't shoot, the men who were beating them were throwing a party, and I want you to get a good long look at the villain while he's still smug, because it's the last time he gets to be. Turin, the Savoy Palace, Louis II, Emperor of the French, holding court over his allies. And I need you to fix this man in your head for the rest of the story, because he is the villain, and he does not look like one. Short, round, a waxed mustache he was visibly, deeply, almost tenderly proud of. He was the nephew of the actual Louis, the one who shook the whole world, and he had inherited the name and the throne and become utterly convinced that the genius came bundled in with them. It did not. He got the mustache. Slouched beside him was his cousin, Prince René. Remember Jerome, too. Remember him harder than anyone else at that table, because he is going to matter more than any of them could dream. 37 years old, built like a wine barrel that had personally given up on itself, sulking into his glass. Jerome had just been married off to the King of Sardinia's daughter, a woman handed across as the literal receipt for French help, and she wanted nothing to do with him and had told him so in ways that had clearly gotten under his skin. He complained about it right there over the good wine to the Emperor of the French, and Louis, swirling his glass, gave his miserable cousin the great strategic wisdom of the House of Bonaparte. Stop whining. Take the girl to Paris after the war, where she'll learn her manners. And in the meantime, go command your Fifth Army like a good boy and try not to embarrass me. I'll spare you the rest of that dinner. The short version is two men who were certain they were winning, toasting each other over wine they hadn't paid for, in a palace that belonged to a king they were already quietly planning to rob blind. Enjoy the soup, gentlemen. Savor it. Meanwhile, in Vienna, the single person I was most afraid of on the entire earth was racing toward me, and she was about 5'8" and wore white roses in her hair. I have to tell you about Alara now, because she is the reason all of this stopped being a book I was trapped inside and turned into a life I chose to fight for with everything I had. Empress Antonia. They called her the most beautiful woman in Europe so constantly and for so long that they all forgot to notice she was also one of the loneliest people in it. The real Otto had married her for love, the one and only time in his whole dutiful, obedient life that he looked his iron mother in the eye and said, "No, this one, I choose this one." And then he did the single most tragically Otto thing a man can do. He won her, and then he buried himself in paperwork and left her completely alone, in a palace full of older women whose entire purpose in life was to correct the way she held her fork. And I knew how her story ended. That's the part that sat behind my eyes the whole time. I knew that 39 years from now, on a sunny promenade beside a lake in Geneva, a man with a sharpened file was going to step up to her and drive it into her heart, and that she would stand back up and tell her lady she felt fine, and walk up the gangway onto the steamer and die quietly on the deck without ever knowing she'd been stabbed. I knew that, the way you know the ending of a film the stranger beside you is watching for the very first time, helplessly, and from the outside. Except she was not a stranger, she was my wife. And I had a 39-year head start on the man with the file. So no, I did not send her away to keep my secret safe. I decided something else entirely, in that borrowed bedroom. I decided that whatever war I fought out here in the mud and the money, there was a second, quieter war I was also going to win. The one where this specific woman does not die frightened and alone in a foreign country. I would cancel that funeral if I had to reorder the entire century to do it. The strange thing is that the peace which made it possible, I didn't even earn. It happened before I ever reached her, and I only heard about it afterward, and it is genuinely the warmest thing in this whole cold-blooded story, so let me give it to you. My mother, the Archduchess Frederica, the Iron Woman who had run autos every waking hour and made Alara's marriage into a slow, correcting misery, had gone into a church and gotten down on her knees and wept, because the doctors had told her my collapse came from strain, and some of that strain had her own name written on it. And Alara, who had every earthly right in the world to leave that proud old woman kneeling there alone in her guilt, came running into the church instead with the news that I was awake, and the two most powerful women in the empire, who had been at Cold War for years, fell into each other's arms and cried. The old chamberlain, a rigid prince who had never once broken a rule of etiquette in his long life, had sprinted, coattails flying, through the palace to carry that telegram. The whole poisoned court let out a breath it had been holding for years. I had done absolutely nothing to cause it, but I fully intended to spend that peace like it was gold in the bank. Then I went and had dinner with 8 of my soldiers, and it took a small permanent chip out of me. They were the 8 men who'd actually hit the target. I changed out of the whole gleaming emperor costume into a plain uniform, so they'd choke a little less on their food in front of God's anointed, and I had the kitchen double the feast. Thuringian sausages, schnitzel, steaks, and these Kaiser pancakes with chocolate that I was frankly overjoyed to learn this century had invented. And the 8 of them sat there rigid as fence posts, each one terrified of reaching for the wrong fork in front of the emperor. So I picked up my own food with my bare hands and ate it like a human being, and watched them slowly, cautiously, decide that this was somehow allowed. And over that dinner, I got the number that turned my stomach worse than 8 out of 60 ever had. I asked them easily how often they trained. Once a month, Majesty. 5 bullets. A soldier in my army fired his own weapon 5 times in a month, and I was expecting these men to stand against French veterans who had personally conquered half of North Africa. I asked where all the money went. And an old sergeant quiet told me the Quadrilateral, the 4 great fortresses east of Milan, maintained at ruinous cost year after year, swallowing the exact budget that should have bought these men the chance to learn which end of the rifle the ball comes out of. I decided somewhere around the chocolate pancakes that after this war I was going to stop pouring gold into those walls forever, win the war, and I wouldn't need them, lose it, and the empire was finished anyway, and a corpse has very little use for a fortress. I let each man carry a plate of food back to his friends still standing in the line, and I told them, quietly, and I meant every syllable, that when all this was over, the men who bled for this empire were going to eat like this more than once a year, and get paid like their lives had a value above nothing at all, and hold in their own hands a piece of the very ground they were being asked to die for. Remember that promise. I made it over a plate of sausages, to 8 ordinary men who had no earthly idea their emperor was sitting at their table. It comes all the way back around, and when it does, it's the best thing I ever did in this whole life, or the last one. That night, I stopped being sentimental and got to work, because sentiment does not win wars. Plans win wars, and I had one. An ugly, elegant, cold-blooded plan, and it started with a spy coming through a hole in the wall. His name was Colonel Schmidt, my best intelligence officer in northern Italy, and he possessed the single most valuable quality a spy can own. He was utterly, gloriously forgettable. An average face on an average frame, the sort of man your eye simply slides off of and forgets it ever saw. He came in through a hidden door in the paneling, because of course a Venetian palace has a hidden door in the paneling, and he laid out what he knew. The French main force was resting at Alessandria, exactly where my gut had already put it, and the great Lombard noble families were already leaking everything they heard straight to Sardinia. "Give me the word, Majesty," Schmidt said, "and I'll have the ringleaders in cells by morning." "No," I said, and I watched him blink. "Don't arrest them. Encourage them. Encourage them. Support them. Fund them, if that's what it takes. Get so far inside their little conspiracy that they trust you with the seating chart. Because here is the thing the nobles never once understood, and it's the whole secret of the country. The peasants weren't with them. The man behind the plow paid a lower tax under me than he ever would under Sardinia, and a hungry man does all his politics with his stomach. The peasants were already mine. I did not care about them. I wanted the names in the fine houses. Every nationalist noble, every capitalist quietly funneling money to the enemy, all of them written down on one clean list so that when the right moment came, I could take the entire treasonous class of them in a single afternoon. And Schmidt, one more thing. I need you to steal me a set of French army uniforms, cavalry, if you can manage it, several sets. He didn't ask why. That is exactly why he was the best man I had. He simply noted it and asked what to call the operation. Prometheus, I said. the one who stole fire from the gods and handed it down to mankind. It felt about right, for a plan built entirely on handing my enemies precisely enough rope to hang themselves with. Schmidt bowed and stepped backward through the wall and was gone. Then my finance minister arrived, and I told him I was going to do the one thing on this earth that frightened him more than bankruptcy did. Baron Schiller was a good man having a genuinely terrible month. Brown hair, a nose like a hawk's beak, the dust of a hard road still gray on his coat, his voice worn all the way down to gravel from too many sleepless nights alone with a ledger. And he did not soften the number for me, which I respected him for enormously. Majesty, at the current rate of bleeding, the government is bankrupt in 3 months. Rothschild has stopped lending. The others have all followed him out the door. Our bonds are being used to wrap fish in London and to light pipes in Frankfurt. There is no more credit anywhere in the world for the name of Austria. And I looked at this exhausted, honest man, and I said, good, then I'm going to seize French capital. He spat out his tea, genuinely, an actual fine spray of it, across my good table. And then he explained to me, in the strangled voice of a man watching his emperor cheerfully douse the treasury in lamp oil and go looking for a match, that no bank on the face of the earth would ever lend to us again, that it was instant, total, and irreversible ruin, that I would end the empire in an afternoon. I'm not going to seize anything, I told him, and let the poor man breathe for a second. I'm going to send soldiers to help operate the railways that so regrettably stopped running. And I've already ordered General Schwarzenberg up in Milan to move every last sack of grain and every bolt of cloth out of that city and into the fortresses. The color went out of his face entirely. You're abandoning Lombardy. Lombardy, a full tenth of the empire's tax revenue, the richest ground we held anywhere. Yes. And then I opened the white folder with the red seal and I let him read the whole thing. Prometheus. Abandon Lombardy, but strip it down to the bare dirt on the way out the door. Take everything. Every depot, every stockpile, every warehouse, and since it was early June and the wheat wasn't even fully ripe yet, take the grain too. Green if we had to. Barter army cloth to the farmers for it so we didn't spend a single coin we didn't have. Leave the enemy a beautiful, rich, empty province with absolutely nothing left in it to put in 100,000 soldiers' mouths. Break first, then build, Schiller. You cannot lay a sound foundation on top of a rotten one. You have to tear the rot out first, all of it, and I am fully prepared to tear out an entire province. I need you to trust me for exactly 3 months. He was quiet a long moment, reading it to the end, and then he closed the folder and looked up and said he was with me. No resignation letter. I actually pointed that out to him, told him I'd half expected one, given the recent fashion among my officers, and the poor tired man almost laughed. And that was the first moment since I'd opened my eyes in this century that a man agreed to follow me not because I was the emperor and he had to, but because he had looked at the plan with his own 2 eyes and decided on the merits that I was right. Up in Milan, it was already happening, in the dark. The city's mayor was a soft, sleepless, permanently terrified Austrian named Werner, a man who kept fast horses saddled day and night in case he ever had to bolt. When my soldiers knocked on his door at 2 in the morning, he very nearly fainted dead away, convinced he was being arrested, before he understood the uniforms were his own sides. An old General Schwarzenberg, white-haired patient, absolutely immovable, stood in the great granaries of Milan and watched the grain flow out of the city by the trainload all night long, while the mayor wrung his soft hands beside him and moaned about the price of bread and the riots that would surely follow and how every bit of it would land on his own head. Schwarzenberg never even turned to look at him. "This old man acts on the emperor's orders," he said. "Nothing else in this world." And then, quietly, almost kindly, so the little man would stop shaking, "We'll take you with us when we go, Mayor." Werner was calm inside of a minute. It is remarkable truly what a frightened man can make his peace with, the instant you promise him a seat on the very last train out of a doomed city. By morning there was less wheat left standing in Milan than I had inside my own hat, and while I was reorganizing an entire empire from a bedroom, Maximilian had ridden all night to take command of a war, and he arrived at headquarters to find the man in charge of it throwing a party. I want to be fair to Kovacs. The man was not evil. He was loyal, in his own useless way. He was also, at the precise hour the French were massing in the dark to cross a river and kill his soldiers, hosting a banquet at the front for his old drinking companion Richter, Tokaji wine, hired dancers, noblewomen down from Milan, the whole glittering business, while the army sat outside in the wet dark waiting for someone, anyone, to remember it existed. Maximilian walked up to the doors of that banquet hall, listened to the music for about 1 full second, and turned to the men behind him. "Kick it open." Bayonets came through the doorway. A champagne glass hit the floor and shattered, and the whole gilded room went instantly, deathly silent. And Kovacs, gloriously, magnificently, world-historically drunk, red-nosed and hiccuping, did not grasp that anything at all was wrong. He squinted at the Archduke standing there in a mud-spattered cavalry coat, and he beamed. He waved a bottle in welcome. He bragged, slurring, that his defense line was solid as gold, impregnable as the walls of Troy. He offered Maximilian a drink, discovered the bottle in his hand was empty, and looked personally, profoundly wounded by that fact. So Maximilian solved the entire problem with one punch. Kovacs left his feet like a kite with a cut string, sailed a genuinely impressive distance across the room, and folded up unconscious on the parquet floor. The only reason nobody in the room panicked that the general had just been killed was that you could immediately hear him snoring, and Maximilian announced to the frozen guests the Emperor's order. Kovacs relieved, Richter relieved, the Archduke now in command. The party, in every possible sense of the word, was over. Richter, to his credit, took it like a gentleman, only tipsy, not drunk, and accepted his dismissal and admitted to Maximilian's face that he'd made a hash of an army he never really understood. And then he read the intelligence sheet I'd sent along about the French, the ranges, the doctrine, the artillery, all of it, and he went very quiet. He had known Otto since the boy was a boy. He looked at those cold, precise notes, and he said half to himself that the emperor he had helped to raise had grown up into something deeper than any of them had ever guessed, which is a lovely, touching sentiment, and also, from where I was sitting, uncomfortably close to the literal truth, so let us keep moving. Because right then, a soldier burst through the door soaked to the skin in his own sweat, and the whole party became instantly, permanently irrelevant. At Palestro, in the dark, the French were crossing the river and the line was buckling. Maximilian's very first question as a commanding general was the correct one, and it told me I had chosen my man exactly right. Was the bridge blown? It was not. And the reason it was not is the single most Austrian thing in this entire war, so savor it. Kovacs had refused to blow the bridge because he wanted to wait until the enemy was actually standing on it. More Frenchmen on the span, you see, bigger casualties, a better, rounder number for the dispatch he'd sent to Vienna. He had left a loaded gun sitting on the table because he was holding out for a more flattering photograph. Maximilian slammed his fist down on the map and said exactly one word, foolish. And then he started fixing it. Wellington a brigade off Horthy to the south. Put my cavalry on the road this instant. He grabbed the exhausted, sweat-soaked messenger and promoted him to sergeant on the spot to serve as a guide, and he sent word upstream to watch the river for a second crossing because the whole thing smelled to him like a trap, and then he rode into the dark toward the sound of the guns. I'll give you that battle in the shape it actually had because I wasn't there for it, and it lives in my memory as a blur of rain and smoke and other men's courage. It was ugly, and it was close. It started at the water, with two Croatian sentries who heard something wrong. One of them, Josip, took a shot at a moving shadow and lived long enough to shout the alarm, and shouted it, in the heat of the thing, in Croatian, which not one of the German officers behind him could understand, so that the very first thing to carry across that riverbank was another sergeant bellowing, use German, you idiot." That's my army, ladies and gentlemen. Even at the moment of ambush, the camp scrambled up in the pitch black, men fumbling with the 40 absurd buttons on their white parade coats while the enemy was already in the water. And somebody had the wit to fire off one of the general's beloved rockets, a Congreve, useless for hitting anything, wildly inaccurate as a weapon, but it went up and it burst, and it hung there in the dark and lit the whole battlefield like a flare, and by that light they finally saw what was coming for them. What was coming was the Zouaves, the elite. The veterans of North Africa in their red caps, night fighters who'd cut their teeth in the mountains of Algeria, and the French colonel had done the coldly practical thing and sent his hottest-headed young major in first, on the sound theory that youth pays for its experience and blood. The major came howling for the glory of France, straight up the bank at the Croatian line, and straight into the traps, because here is what the French did not know about these particular Croatians. They were mountain men, velvet hunters, boys who'd been trapping wolves and lynx across those slopes since before they could properly walk, and given a single night to prepare a position, they had done exactly what a hunter does: pit traps, tripwire snares, a whole dark hillside quietly rigged to catch anything that charged up it. The leading rank of that glorious Zouave assault hit ground that opened underneath them, and it broke the rhythm of the charge the way a stumble breaks a sprinter. But there were only 150 Austrians on that bank, and there were a very great many Zouaves, and numbers are their own kind of weather. The Croatian captain gave the order to fall back into the town in good order, by the plan, and they went. And then it became a knife fight in the streets of Palestro, house by house, around an old Gothic church. And this is where I want you to meet a boy named Anton, because he had the best night of anyone on my side of that river, and I never once got the chance to thank him for it properly. Anton was a Tyrolean, a hunter's son, the kind of boy who'd been putting meat on his family's table with a rifle since he was 10 years old. And when the fighting reached the church, he climbed the bell tower with 2 rifles and a bag of cartridges, and he went to work. He'd fire one, hand it down to be reloaded, take up the other. One careful shot at a time. The way you shoot a chamois you cannot afford to miss, because if you miss, your family doesn't eat. He dropped 6 of them. 6 French veterans picked cleanly off the street below, one at a time, until the entire advance down that lane simply stopped moving, every soldier in it suddenly extremely interested in doorways and shadows. It took a captured cannon to finish him. The French wheeled one of our own guns around and put a ball into the base of the tower, and the whole thing came down. And even then, he got out. Last man off it, down a rope he had rigged before he ever climbed up, because mountain boys always plan the way down before they plan the way up. My reserves barely, just barely, held the town center, but the boy in the tower had bought them the minutes that decided everything, and then the battle turned on 2 men doing their jobs, one on each side. The enemy commander was Messina, a tough old hand from the African wars with a dueling scar he was proud of, and this was only ever a probe. He was traveling light, testing us, not yet committed. When his best troops got bloodied on our traps, he did the cold professional thing. He pulled his zouaves back out and shoved his weak partners forward in their place, the Sardinian conscripts. 2 months of training, muskets from the last century, sent to soak up the fight and be measured while he watched, safe, from the rear. And my man was a boy named Jules, and I love this part so much I'm going to slow all the way down for it. Jules was a young engineer from the Academy of Sciences, glasses, the earnest, brilliant sort who has tested his invention exactly 3 times in a quiet workshop and is therefore serenely certain of it. Earlier that same night he'd been handed the single most important job on the whole field. Blow the Palestro Bridge with a new electrical detonator, his own design, so the French could not cross, and it had failed him at the worst possible moment of his entire life. Picture it. He's crouched over the plunger. The enemy is massing on the far bank. He presses the switch, the way he'd pressed it 3 times in that quiet workshop, and nothing. Dead silence, where there should have been thunder. Someone grabbed the box off him and slammed it, and this time it fired, but the powder had gone damp in the river air, and the blast only dropped part of the span and left the rest standing there in a mocking half-ruin, still just wide enough for the enemy to keep pouring across it 2 at a time. His life's work, a dud at the decisive hour. They sent him to the rear a broken man, and he went, shaking, certain he had personally lost the battle for everyone. And then he came back. In the middle of the fight, this glasses-wearing boy shoved his way up to the Archduke who was commanding the entire battle and demanded a second chance because he'd watched the cavalry dragging their little 6-pound field guns up the road and he had had an idea. Now, most generals on Earth would have had him dragged off for the sheer nerve of it. But Maximilian, and this is exactly why Maximilian is worth 10 of Kovats. Maximilian looked at the shaking young man and heard him out and said yes. Go. Take the guns. So in the rain, with the whole fight hanging on it and 3,000 cavalry waiting on his word, this failed, humiliated boy walked up to a battery of field guns and took command of them like he'd been born holding the lanyard. He sighted them himself, cool as still water. He called the range and the elevation off the top of his head. Raise 5 degrees. Because he had studied that bridge, he knew every weak joint in it. He'd thought about nothing else for an hour. 6 guns fired, 4 shells struck the exact points he'd named, and the whole structure groaned and sagged and finally came down into the black water, taking the enemy's only road down with it. And Jules turned to the general and pushed his wet glasses up his nose with one finger and said, I am told, perfectly deadpan, like a man reading out a weather report. This is the power of science, sir. I gave that boy a medal later. I'd have given him a duchy if he'd thought to ask. With the bridge gone and the far bank cut off, the cavalry did the rest, and I want to tell you exactly what a cavalry charge does to green troops, because it is the whole reason I fought this entire war the way I did. 3,000 horsemen came out of the dark at the exposed Sardinian conscripts, and those boys could not form a square. A veteran unit forms a square when the horses come. It's the one thing on earth that saves you, a hedgehog wall of bayonets facing out on every side that a horse simply will not run itself onto. But forming a square under a charge takes nerve and drill and a sergeant you die for, and these boys had 2 months of training and a musket from their grandfather's war, and no earthly idea what they were doing on that field. The first one broke and ran, and panic is the most contagious thing on any battlefield ever fought, faster than fire, faster than any plague. The second man saw the first one run, and then they were all running, and a running man with his back turned is not a soldier anymore. He's just prey. The formation came apart, and it stopped being a battle. It was a very bad night to be 18 years old and from Piedmont holding a gun that somebody had pushed into your hands 2 months before in the name of a country you had never once in your whole short life heard anybody call a country. Palestro was ours. The news reached me at 5 in the morning over red tea and bread, and Gustav was beaming as he laid it down. A great victory, 2,000 of the enemy taken prisoner, but I made myself sit with the whole of it, not just the shining half, because we had also lost 2,000 of our own, and my medical corps was a bad joke. Too few surgeons, half of them still convinced that disease rides into a wound on bad air. Wounded men lying in long rows, cleaning their own injuries with river water, and dying of it 3 days later. So before I let myself feel a single thing about the victory, I gave 3 orders. First, the chemists down at Padua were to start producing alcohol at strength, 75% an hour, for the cleaning of wounds, because I happened to know, from a century that had learned it in an ocean of blood, that clean was the entire difference between a soldier who comes home and a soldier who rots in a tent. Second, strip the prisoners of their uniforms and have the local tailors copy them exactly, French cut, every button. I was going to need those. You'll see why. And the third order, well, we'll get to the third one. Then, and only then, I let myself say one quiet sentence, out loud, aimed at a banker 400 miles away in Vienna who did not yet even know that he and I were at war. Rothschild, you want to be a financial emperor? Go and dream. Here is what I meant by that, and it is my single favorite move of the entire campaign, because I won a battle in a room where nobody fired a shot. That very same morning, the instant the exchange opened its doors in Vienna, a white-haired gentleman that not one soul on the floor had ever laid eyes on walked in off the street. He gave his name as Marius, which was not his name, and behind him came a column of men in black hauling heavy strongboxes. At the opening bell, the men set the boxes down and threw them open, and they were full of gold. Fresh Austrian coin, stacked and gleaming under the gaslight, and the white-haired stranger made exactly one announcement to the room. 20 million florins, I will buy every Austrian war bond on this market. Now you have to understand what an Austrian war bond was worth that morning, so let me put it in terms a person can feel. It was worth nothing. They had collapsed to something like a 500th of the price of a French bond. They were a punchline in every counting house in Europe. Men were using them as scrap paper. The floor manager reportedly had to be helped into a chair because a junior officer in my army earned 24 florins in a month, and this apparition had just bid 20 million on paper the whole world was using to wrap fish. And then the small investors did the thing that small investors always do. They saw big, calm, absolutely confident money moving with total certainty, and they threw themselves in behind it, scrambling and shoving for the scraps, each one dead sure that a man with that much gold in his boxes must know something they didn't. And he did know something they didn't. Here is the reveal. Marius was mine. The gold was Schiller's last emergency reserve, scraped together in a single frantic night, plus every florin the Habsburg family could quietly pool, because, and this genuinely startled me when I learned it, the Emperor of Austria is not a personally rich man. My abdicated uncle was still sitting on half the good royal property like a toad on a jewel. My own mother and my own wife had helped raise that gold in one night, and if the gamble failed, the government fell the next morning. It was every single thing we had, bet on one card, face down, and at noon, that card turned over. The news of Palestro reached Vienna, and the bonds, the worthless paper that a madman had bought up the entire supply of that very morning, jumped. Every man who had gleefully sold his scrap to the strange white-haired gentleman at dawn got to watch it turn valuable by lunch. Every man who'd piled in behind him made a small fortune and went home worshipping the ground he walked on, and not one of them ever suspected that they had just been the hired muscle in a bluff. I had turned a battlefield victory into a financial one, using money I did not actually have, on the strength of a battle I already knew, cover to cover, that we were going to win. The rest of the world still bet on France. Fine, let them. Every last coin wagered against Austria was a coin I fully intended to collect in person, with interest. Schiller, who had spent that entire night watching me gamble his treasury on a horse only I could see running, aged about a year on the spot, and then, I think, for the very first time in this whole grinding war, he began to genuinely enjoy himself. The next fight I picked was with a room full of doctors, and it was nearly as satisfying as the one on the exchange floor. I had a problem, and it was killing my soldiers. My wounded were dying of things that should not kill anybody, because medicine in 1859 was a coin flip performed by men who did not wash their hands between the corpse and the mother. So I invited every physician of any standing in Venice to a banquet. 120 of them came, and at every single place setting I laid a printed manual, and then I sat back in an anteroom and listened to them very nearly come to blows before I had even walked in, because I'd built that manual entirely around germ theory. The radical, offensive, insulting idea that invisible living creatures in the filth on a blade were the thing that killed the man on the table. and half that room were young believers, and half were old men who knew for an absolute stone fact that disease came from bad air, from miasma, from the vapors, and I heard, through the door, one very distinguished surgeon inform another that his theory was about as sound as his aunt's cow. Wonderful. Exactly my kind of room. Then I walked in. And the oldest, sharpest surgeon in the place, a 30-year veteran named Salvatore, the sort of man who has watched emperors and their fashions come and go and personally outlived most of them, asked me the fair question, straight to my face, in front of everyone. Have you studied medicine, Majesty? Now, I could not tell that man the truth. I could not stand up in a Venetian banquet hall in 1859 and say, I read about a Frenchman named Lemaire and an Englishman named Florence in a world 160 years past all of your deaths. So I reached instead for the one cover story that a devout Catholic surgeon could not immediately disprove. During my coma, I said with a completely, serenely straight face, I was visited by an angel, and the angel imparted certain truths to me. This, I should mention, became something of a recurring feature of my whole career here, the angel, and later, a book I'd happened to read, and later still, a firebomb that the Russians had definitely invented and that had nothing whatsoever to do with me. When you know things you cannot possibly know, you learn very quickly to launder them, and it turns out that heaven is extremely difficult to cross-examine, but I did not leave it at faith, because faith does not hold a room full of scientists for very long. I showed them. I had a microscope set up on the table, and a surgical knife still stained, which I had borrowed that very morning from the maternity ward down the road. I laid the blade under the lens and invited them to come and look, one by one, at the swarming, writhing, living filth crawling on that steel, the steel that had, 1 hour earlier, been inside a mother, and I watched 30 years of iron certainty crack right behind old Salvatore's eyes, because a man cannot unsee the invisible once you have finally shown it to him. Then I wiped the blade clean with my 75% alcohol, and had them look again, at nothing, clean. That, I said, into the silence, is what has been killing your patients, not the air, that. And then I offered them the future, in exchange for one favor. I would found an imperial medical college, real laboratories, real funding, the finest equipment on the continent, all of it, for them. And Salvatore, being absolutely nobody's fool, smelled the price on it and named it before I could. You want us to go and build a field hospital, at the front, for your soldiers. The first proper one in all of Lombardy. Yes. There was a flicker in that room. A great many of these men had complicated feelings about Italy, about unification, about which side of this war their hearts sat on, but I guaranteed their safety, rear lines, armed escort, the college standing ready for them when they came home, and Salvatore looked at the microscope, and then he looked at me, for a long moment, and he committed first, and the rest of them followed him the way they always had. That is how the Austrian Empire got itself a medical college and a field hospital out of a single dinner and one very well-timed lie about an angel. And the soldiers I'd promised a better life to, over the sausages, this was the first payment on that debt. I do not forget which promises I've made. It is, honestly, the only reliably honest thing about me. Back in Vienna, my cabinet was doing what every cabinet on earth does in a crisis, which is argue. There was a peace faction that wanted to run and beg for terms before we lost anything else, and there was my interior minister, Müller, a man who had been a firebrand revolutionary in 1848 and then switched sides so hard and so completely that he became the empire's chief enforcer, its iron fist, and Müller was calling the peace seekers cowards to their faces and blaming the whole isolated mess on years of idiot foreign policy. He was not wrong. The argument was still going strong when Schiller swept into the room waving the Palestro telegram, and the peace faction discovered on the spot that it had been brave and steadfast all along. There is nothing on this earth that converts a coward to the war quite so fast as a victory he had no hand in. And out in the country, my soldiers were taking the railways back, and I would have paid gold coin to stand and watch it. Picture the great station at Graz. Every southbound train suspended for maintenance, the line French owned, mysteriously broken the exact week the war turned serious, and the platform packed with furious stranded passengers, one woman weeping openly because the delay meant she was going to miss her own mother's funeral, and then the doors bang open, and white uniforms pour in with the bayonets fixed, and a colonel unrolls an imperial order and reads it out. The army is resuming operation of this station, effective immediately. The station master shrieks about private property, about rights, about the law. The bayonets are entirely unmoved by the concept of private property. And the man goes sprinting for the telegraph to warn his employer, a Mr. Levy, and the colonel actually smiles at his back and calls after him to hurry. Please, do send it, because this time we are taking Austria's railways back. The trains ran south that very afternoon. Purely a maintenance matter, you understand. That name on the telegram, David, is the one you need now. I have been circling my real enemy long enough. It is time you met him properly. Anselm David von Rothschild ran the Vienna house of the single most powerful banking family the world has ever produced, and for 20 years, in every way that actually mattered, he had owned the finances of the Austrian Empire, lent to it, leaned on it, shaped it to fit his own hand. And that very evening he did one small, quiet thing that told me exactly the kind of man I was fighting, though I only pieced it together sometime later. There was a man in my government named Killian, my quartermaster general, and the whole empire's favorite success story. A commoner, a man of no birth at all, who had risen every rung of the way to the very top on nothing but raw merit, and who still lived in an ordinary house in an ordinary district because he had somehow never learned how to steal. The Habsburgs adored pointing at him. Look how we reward talent. Look how fair and how modern we are. And when Killian came home to that ordinary house that night, David Goldstein was already inside it, sitting on the man's own sofa, charming the man's own wife over the man's own tea. That is the flex, you understand. That is the entire message, delivered without a word. I own your coachman, I own your credit, and I am drinking your tea in your parlor to make certain that you understand, all the way down in your stomach, that there is no wall anywhere between us. Then he took the quartermaster general out for a friendly little turn in the carriage and reminded him gently of the leverage. Years ago, when Killian's young daughter was dying and no honest salary on earth could pay for the doctors who might save her, it had been David's money that saved the girl. The one and only impure thing that honest man had ever done in his life was take help for his sick child, and it had made him a slave. David wanted one last job. He dangled a promotion for it, chief of the general staff, and the good man agreed through his teeth because a father in that particular trap always agrees. But here is the crack in David, the one I could already see, running right through him, the same crack that runs through every man built like him. His whole grand design depended on Austria drowning. Let the empire go bankrupt, let it sink beneath the water, and then throw it a rope woven out of loans and haul it back up as a possession, a vassal state with its own flag to keep up appearances. And it was not working. Maximilian kept winning. And that very morning, some maniac had walked onto the exchange and bought up every war bond in existence, and David's own investigators had chased that mystery and found precisely nothing, and two of the men he'd sent looking into it had turned up dead. So he sat in his carriage, certain that nothing and no one alive could stop the rise of the new emperor of Europe, meaning himself, meaning money, meaning 20 years of holding the leash on an entire continent. He had no idea, none, that the maniac who'd bought the bonds and the emperor he was trying to bankrupt were the very same person, and that that person had already read the final page of his story before ever writing the first line of his own. I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered how Alara dies, in the history where men like David get to keep on winning, and the feeling passed clean off me. Now, the most important thing that happened that whole week was not on any battlefield, and it was not on any trading floor. It happened in a quiet room in Vienna, and it was about my wife quietly becoming the very last person on earth that anyone should ever have made the mistake of underestimating. My mother took Alara aside, the two of them warm now, at last, after that day in the church, and showed her a secret the court had kept from her for the entire length of her marriage. A room, full of women, elegant, educated, entirely unremarkable-looking women, who between them read and sorted a flood of intelligence that flowed in by telegraph from every capital in Europe. My mother ran a spy network. They called it the Black Swan, and it was staffed deliberately by the exact people that no general or minister on earth would ever think to suspect, which is precisely, exactly why it worked so well. Ballroom dancers, governesses, widows, a whole empire's worth of women that powerful men spoke freely in front of, because it never once crossed their minds that a beautiful woman in the corner might be listening on purpose. And they handed Alara 2 pieces of paper that changed her forever. The first was a threat assessment on Hungary, and it flagged one single name at the very highest level of danger, Count Esterházy, a charming former rebel, secretly, patiently, reaching back out to the old Hungarian nobles. And Esterházy was Alara's friend, one of the handsome, laughing men she had raced horses with, back when she was a lonely girl in a cold palace and they were the only souls at court who ever made her feel alive. She felt the betrayal land like an open hand across the face. The second piece of paper was worse, a case file on stolen weapons. Old muskets vanished out of the Hungarian warehouses, an inspector conveniently frozen to death in a drunken stupor before he could talk, and the trail on that paper led straight, damningly, to Killian, the commoner hero, the man she and I both admired above almost anyone. She was friends with his wife. She refused to believe it, flatly, out loud, and said so. My mother gave her the assignment anyway: investigate him yourself, clear him, or convict him. And I am fairly certain, looking back, that it was as much a test of Alara as it was of Killian, that my mother wanted to know for herself whether the girl who had married her son had the spine to pull on a thread that might hurt her own hand. She did. That is the thing they all underestimated, every last one of them, right up until it was far too late to start being afraid. The woman that all of history would remember for her hair and her sadness picked up that file, in that room, and became a blade, and she never once, in all the time that followed, asked me for permission to do it. I married her for love, in a life I only inherited. I got to keep her because she turned out to be better at all of this than any of us. But I am getting ahead of my own story. Back to the war, where the little emperor with the enormous mustache had just finished a plan he was very, very proud of. At Alessandria, the Allies held a war council, and it was a glorious thing to picture, because they spent most of it hating each other. 100,000 French and 40,000 Sardinians crammed into one town, and after the Palestro disaster, the Sardinian generals wanted Massena's head on a plate for the unauthorized attack that had gotten 2,000 of their own boys killed. The French, for their part, considered the Sardinians to be slow, feeble cannon fodder who broke after a single cavalry charge, which, to be entirely fair to the French, they had. Each side privately assumed the other one would be spent soaking up bullets. And into that poisoned little room strutted Louis II to announce that he had already made the plan. Thank you. No discussion required. It was a clever plan. It genuinely was. Feint hard at Palestro to pull my army in, then throw his real weight across the river upstream, where I wasn't looking. It was the plan of a man who was fighting the Austria that existed last month. He was not fighting that Austria anymore, because I already knew he would do it, and I had already found the one loose thread running through his entire grand alliance, and the loose thread's name was Rossini. You need to understand Rossini, because he is the most dangerous, honest man in this whole war, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to pay. He was a revolutionary who wanted, simply and without 1 ounce of complication, a single thing: Italy, united and free, and did not personally care in the slightest whether it ended up a republic or a kingdom, so long as it was Italian and it was free. He wore a faded red shirt and a hat his dead wife had woven for him with her own hands, and he led a couple thousand ragged, half-starved mountain fighters called the Alpine Hunters, and he was gratefully, trustingly, wholeheartedly on Louis's side, because Louis had promised to help set Italy free. And Rossini did not know the thing that I knew. He did not know about the secret deal his own side had cut with France, in a spa town called Plombières, the one where Sardinia, to buy itself French bayonets, had quietly agreed to hand France 2 whole chunks of Italian soil, Savoy, and a city called Nice. Rossini was born in Nice. Sit with that for a second, because I did, grinning like an idiot, for a solid minute when I first laid it all out in my head. The single most beloved patriot in all of Italy was fighting and bleeding and starving for an alliance that had already secretly sold his own hometown to a foreign emperor, and he had no idea. And when that man found out, when, not if, because I was personally going to see to it, his rage was not going to be a speech. It was going to be a wound, driven straight through the middle of Sardinia. So I turned to my spy master and I said, "Schmidt, come here. Some secrets you keep. And some you gift wrap and address neatly and mail directly to the one man on earth guaranteed to detonate when he opens the box." I had also, in the meantime, been quietly starving the man, which I felt slightly worse about. One of my generals had beaten Rossini's foragers to the grain around Varese and simply bought it all, legally, bartering imperial goods for it, so that when Rossini's supply officer came looking, the cupboards were bare, and the farmers would not sell to him anyway. And this is the part that shows you how the whole board actually worked. The Lombard peasants were not with Rossini. They were with me, not out of any love, out of arithmetic. Austrian taxes ran lower than Sardinian ones, and I had flooded the countryside with leaflets, drawn in pictures because half of them couldn't read, showing them exactly that. Nationalism, as it turns out, is a luxury enjoyed almost entirely by people who already own things. The man behind the plow simply wanted the smaller tax bill, and I was the smaller tax bill. Rossini's own beloved countrymen were calling my soldiers friends and his men beggars, and it was breaking his honest heart, and there was nothing on earth he could do about it, because he refused, on principle, to take grain by force from the very people he was trying to free. An honest man in a war is a beautiful, doomed thing. I intended to pick him up and aim him like a rifle. Louis's clever feint played out exactly as I had promised Maximilian it would. The enemy came across the river again in the fog, at night, building a pontoon bridge in the dark, betting everything they had on surprise, and they lost that bet before they ever started, because an Austrian patrol led by a superstitious captain who trusted his own bad feelings had already heard them out in the water. We knew. We had set the trap, and the fog that was supposed to hide the attackers only meant that they could not see the muzzles waiting for them up on the high ground. I'll spare you the full blow-by-blow, because it was the same grim shape as before. A brave Sardinian colonel, top of his class, half his powder soaked through from the crossing, leading a doomed column up a wooded slope into Austrian guns that fought and fell back and fought and fell back until his exhausted men were strung out in the open, and then the whole line rose up on 3 sides at once. Downstream, the main crossing hit a Croatian brigade under a young general so handsome the story could not stop mentioning it, a man who had walked out of the ballrooms of Vienna to go stand in exactly this kind of horror. And he held that pontoon line through 2 solid hours of the worst close fighting there is, and he did not break. By dawn, the whole river line had held. Every ford. Lewis's beautiful plan came back to him soaked to the skin and empty-handed, but I took one honest, sobering thing away from it. The French were better than I had wanted them to be. They had very nearly won footholds in 3 separate places. This was not going to be a war I won by being clever exactly one time. I was going to have to be clever every single day, without a break, and I was going to have to hand the little emperor a defeat so total that his soul left his body through his ears. So I reached into my bag of things from the future, and I pulled out 2 of them. The first was diplomatic, and it happened in Berlin, and it is one of my favorite scenes I was not personally present for. I had sent an envoy, a man named Clemens, to go and talk to Prussia, and the Prussians were certain they held every card in the deck. They figured a losing Austria would come crawling on its knees for their help and pay any price at all for it. So their Prince Regent leaned back in his chair and demanded that I recognize Prussian leadership over all the German states, and then he sneered that even my best offer was far too little, because once France had finished beating me, I would simply hand it all over for free. And Clemens, precisely as I had instructed him, did the one single thing they had not planned for. He stood up, he bowed, and he walked out, not out of the room, out of Berlin. He left the city entirely and got on a train for St. Petersburg. The Prince Regent and his minister had bet their whole strategy on Clemens crawling back over a glass of sherry, and instead they got to stand at the window and watch his train pull away. There is no leverage on this earth quite like the visible, cheerful willingness to walk away from the table, and I had just taught it to the men who thought they were teaching it to me. The second thing I pulled out of the bag was on fire. I'd already had my scientists take a hard look at what we had, an experimental battery of rifled cannon sitting forgotten in a shed, better than anything on the field, a breech-loading rifle everyone had given up on because it jammed, the exact weapon the Prussians were quietly building their whole future army around, and I'd told them to stop giving up and start fixing, and watch them write down my instructions with the patient faces of men humoring the family lunatic. But the thing I needed right now was simpler and nastier than any of that. I had my chemists mix kerosene and alcohol and a little sugar to make it cling and pour it into bottles, a weapon so simple a frightened teenager could throw one, and so vicious that water would not put it out. It would stick and burn for 5 meters and follow a man right into the river. Austria, as it happened, was one of the very first places on Earth pumping oil up out of the ground, so I had the ingredients by the barrel. We made 6,000 of them in a single day in Venice, and when the men asked me what to call it and where on earth it had come from, I told them, with a completely straight face, that it was a Russian invention. Nothing to do with us. A Molotov, I called it, after nobody in particular. Between the angel who taught me medicine and the Russians who invented my firebombs, I was assembling quite a fine collection of other people to blame for the things I somehow knew, and then I made the move that mattered more than all the rest of it combined, the one that would decide whether any of the other cleverness held together. I sent a gift to Russia. At the Berlin station, 2 enormous men from my military intelligence met my envoy and handed him a very heavy backpack and gave him his true orders, the ones I had not dared put through the normal channels because they flatly contradicted my own foreign secretary's entire life's policy and would have told anyone who read them that a purge was coming in Vienna. Clemens's one mission in St. Petersburg was to do the impossible, to undo the great betrayal and win Russia back, and the gift in that backpack was for the Tsar himself. Clemens hefted the weight of it and understood, all at once, that the young emperor he served was about to flip the entire chessboard of Europe over onto the floor, and that betting on me was going to be either the end of his career or the making of it. He got on the train. Everyone kept getting on trains for me that week. It is a very good feeling, watching your plan pull out of the station right on time. And then I did something that made my staff seriously reconsider the mental illness rumors, which was to shave off my own face and hire a stranger to be me. Here's the reasoning. My best troops were drilled to a mirror shine, but not one of them had ever been properly blooded, and I needed them tempered by fire before the real battle came, and I wanted to be there when it happened. But an emperor cannot exactly go on a night raid. So I had a nervous Venice barber shave off Otto's signature beard, and just like that, the most recognizable face in the empire became a middling middle-class gentleman that even Alara wouldn't have picked out of a crowd, and then I installed a body double in my bed. A poor fellow of a rough 70% likeness once the makeup was on, and I spent a genuinely comic afternoon teaching him to walk like me and hold his chin like me and cough like a man recovering from a coma while I fed him lines. Follow me and learn. He was terrified. The emperor is ill and recuperating, the official story would run, seeing no one, while the real emperor, clean-shaven and anonymous, took a bumpy train toward the front to go put his precious soldiers into the crucible himself. Only blood forges a warrior, and I was done sending men to be forged where I couldn't watch. The train did about 30 miles an hour and rattled my teeth loose, and I sat there dreaming wistfully of a padded first-class carriage that wouldn't exist for another 40 years. And I planned the nastiest thing I'd done yet. I gave my cheerful spherical General Schneider a monstrous amount of firepower, the experimental rifled battery, 2 extra artillery regiments, dozens of guns, and then I gave him an order that made the blood drain straight out of his round face. 3 hours after a certain assault team left camp, he was to take his 20,000 men across the river and attack the Sardinian main force. 40,000 of them, maybe more, maybe with the French mixed in. Schneider thought it was a death sentence and said so. He'd read his history. He knew what happened to generals who charged an army twice their size. But I showed him the other half of the plan. Count Kinsky's whole army would hit them at the same moment from the other side, and Schneider would have more cannon than every gun the Sardinians owned put together. His signal that it had all worked, that the night had gone right, Alessandria's sky lit up orange with fire, because that was the real operation, and I called it Loki, after the Norse god who lies and tricks and burns things down. One of my colonels called it dishonorable. This was a century that still half believed war should be a gentleman's duel, and I told him the truth I actually believed. This is a brutal war. To bring my soldiers home alive, to keep this empire breathing, I will use any means that works, and Sardinia broke the gentleman's rules first. Schmidt's spies had pinned the enemy's main supply depot, Alessandria, at the confluence of the rivers, the great rail hub, and, because the whole front had been drained forward, very lightly guarded, and its forts all facing east toward where they expected me. So my assault team, dressed head to toe in the French uniforms we'd stripped off the Palestro prisoners, was going to drive up from the lightly guarded west, posing as a French supply convoy, and walk straight in the front gate. The little firebombs were the key. A small team can't burn a mountain of supplies with torches. A small team with 6,000 bottles of clinging, unquenchable fire absolutely can. Meanwhile, 100 miles away in Munich, I had other slower fish on the line. A pair of pro-war lobbyists were trying to push the King of Bavaria into mobilizing, into reclaiming a little German prestige, and the king, a scholarly, endlessly indecisive man who governed by committee and consulted professors about everything, could not make up his mind and broke for lunch instead. That's fine. That was a seed, not a harvest. I'd come back for Bavaria later. At the staging town of Sawardi, I found my army sunning itself with all the security discipline of a church picnic, a few board sentries standing in plain sight, so I imported, on the spot, a modern system of hidden sentries and secret signals and fast cavalry scouts, and had it telegraphed to Maximilian as the new standard across the whole army. The hidden sentries promptly arrested a suspicious, clean-shaven gentleman wandering the camp, which was me, which I found deeply reassuring, and I learned there what my men were actually paid, 8 florins a month, and a young private only $5, while a man sweeping a factory floor in Vienna made 8. So I declared, on the spot, a 50% pay raise for the entire army, backdated to the first day of the war, morale, and the pleasant knowledge that somebody else was going to end up paying the bill. Then I watched my engineers building pontoon bridges the slow way, one section at a time, 5 hours a bridge, and I taught them to build the thing in 10 prefabricated sections all at once, and cut the time to a fraction, and the shirtless colonel in charge looked at me like I'd handed him fire from heaven. Which, in a manner of speaking. And on the evening of the 6th of June, the French convoy rolled up to the depot outside Alessandria. The garrison was slack, half of them, including the commander, off at a festival in the city, the rest bored and half drunk. Torchlit, unhurried, a column of tired French soldiers escorting supply wagons, nothing to see, the sentries stopped them, and my colonel, playing a French officer of the arrogant sort, simply refused to lower himself to speak to enlisted men, while my other man, playing a supply merchant, greased the disheveled deputy in charge with French francs and a bottle of very good wine, presented a red-sealed order that looked entirely genuine, and when asked his own name, gave it with a perfectly straight face as a small private joke. Rossini, a Savoyard. The convoy rolled in through the gate. One sentry got curious about the strange bottles packed among the ammunition crates and went to take a closer look and did not come back. And then the teams went quietly to work, firebombs and charges tucked in among a sleeping garrison and a mountain of the enemy's food and powder, and lit the fuses and left. Across the river at Sawardi, I stood in the dark and watched, and I'll be honest, I hate the assault kind of victory. I would always rather outsmart a man than spend my soldiers throwing themselves at him, partly because those German elites were too precious to burn, and partly because I had promised 8 men over sausages that I valued their lives, and I meant it. So I stood there, and I waited, and my stomach was in a knot. And then the whole northern sky went orange. The depot went up in a fireball you could read a newspaper by from a mile off. 9/10 of the entire Allied supply for 200,000 men gone in a single night, to a few dozen men in stolen coats and a cart full of bottles. The newspapers the next morning, fed by my own intelligence chief, screamed that the Austrian army had routed 50,000, wild, glorious exaggeration, wonderful for the war bonds, when the sober truth was that Schneider and Kinski had smashed 2 Sardinian divisions across the river, burned their camp, taken 3,000 prisoners, and pulled back in good order before the French could arrive. And with the depot gone, I turned. The Prometheus screws one notch tighter, destroy the branch railways now, burn the farmland we couldn't harvest in time, and point the next blow squarely at Prince René's weak French Fifth Army. Time, as I told my staff with a smile I'm not proud of, to entertain dear Prince René. In Turin, the King of Sardinia smashed a priceless porcelain vase against a wall when they told him about the depot. 9/10 of his supplies gone. His whole strategy, years of grinding taxes to fund a small, high-quality army, in ruins, with only half-trained conscripts left to fill the gap. His minister Mazzini warned him, again, that Sardinian taxes were already the highest in Europe and could not be raised another inch without the country coming apart. The king raised them anyway and sent to beg Louis for guns and food, and said, to no one in particular, that for Italy he would sacrifice anything. He had already given away his daughter and promised away his dynasty's ancestral homeland. And Mazzini, watching him, said the truest and most useless thing of the whole war: any ally can betray you. Look at how Austria stabbed Russia. Beware of France. And up in the northern mountains, Rossini finally got fed by the young son of an old dead comrade, a count named Visconti, who opened his own granaries to the starving Alpine hunters. Visconti told him something troubling. The Austrians were buying up every scrap of grain in Lombardy, paying in coin and goods, which surely meant they were preparing to run. And Visconti confided proudly that he had secretly made contact with a whole network of anti-Austrian nobles, all ready to rise the moment came. Rossini, tired and paternal, warned the young man off it. Don't contact the nobles. You've done enough. If this fails, you'll lose everything and end up in exile like me. But it was already too late. Because as the two of them talked, a serving maid slipped quietly out a side door and walked a little way down the road and pressed 3 coins into the hand of a waiting beggar. Traitor confirmed. Count Visconti had just added his own name to my list, and Prometheus, patient and invisible, wound one more thread around one more throat. Now let me give you the 2 payoffs, because they landed within days of each other, and between them they turned the entire war. The bonds first. When the news of the burned depot and the smashed divisions hit Frankfurt, and I had worded the dispatch very carefully to make it sound as though we'd beaten France herself and not merely her starving little partner, the exchange lost its mind. Austrian bonds that had bottomed out below a single florin went rocketing up to 21, more than 10 times over. And while every small investor in Europe was clawing over his neighbor to buy the paper my man had scooped up for pennies, Schiller and the royal steward very quietly sold the family's holdings back into that frenzy, at better than 20 times what we'd paid for them. 20 times, in a single week. The Emperor of Austria had just run the single most profitable trade on the whole continent by insider dealing his own war, and the beautiful part, the part that let me sleep, was that every florin of it was clean, because I had made the news true by winning the battle first. My finances went from 3 months to live to comfortably, boringly solvent. The knife came off my throat. I still had to beat the French in the open field or none of it stuck. Money buys you time, not victory. But for the first time since I'd opened my eyes in a dead man's bed, I was no longer counting down to bankruptcy. And then Russia said yes. My envoy reached St. Petersburg and walked straight into a czar who despised us. Nicholas II, still nursing the Crimean betrayal like a bruise that would not fade, opened with the icy little question of why I hadn't come to grovel in person. Was I afraid? And Clemens did exactly what I had sent him across a continent to do. He threw my own foreign secretary directly under the wheels of the train. The emperor was misled, Majesty, badly advised, and that advisor's days are already numbered. And then he opened the backpack. Inside was a gift I had chosen with enormous care, a model, worked in gold and silver, of the Hagia Sophia. It had been crafted years earlier for the old Tsar and never delivered because he had inconveniently died first, and I had hunted it down across half of Europe because I knew precisely what it would say to a Russian emperor who called himself the protector of all Orthodox Christendom. It said, "Help me, and one day you get the real one back, Constantinople." I pledged Austria's full support for Russia rebuilding her Black Sea fleet, and someday for taking back the city of cities itself, in exchange for Russia's blessing on a Germany united under me. And when the Tsar still hesitated, my giant of an intelligence officer broke his silence to close the deal with a carve-up of a Balkan principality along the mountains, and Orthodox souls resettled north into Russia's waiting arms. The Tsar signed an alliance, he said, as unbreakable as steel. With one gift and one promise, I had undone the single worst mistake in the whole history of Austria and turned my dead eastern border into a friend, which meant the 150,000 elite troops I had been forced to leave sitting there for years, staring at Russia, could now board trains and come west to the war that actually mattered. Steiner had once asked me, carefully, for 50,000 more men. I was about to hand him 150,000, conjured out of thin air by the simple trick of making a friend where there had been an enemy. That is the entire thesis of everything I did in this century. If you want it in one line, the real weapons are the ones that nobody ever thinks to count. And while I was out making friends, my enemies were busy robbing each other blind, which is genuinely the most satisfying spectacle this world has to offer. Start with Sardinia. Louis had taken Milan and won his headlines. But my burned depot meant his whole allied army was starving now. And Louis looked at his desperate, hungry junior partner and saw not an ally in trouble, but a sheep ready for shearing. He faked an illness so he wouldn't have to greet the king of Sardinia with any warmth at all, and then he had a smirking young banker's son quote the king prices for French rifles that would have made a highwayman blush, and offered a loan to pay for it on one small condition: sign here. And here mortgaged Sardinia's customs revenue to France, threw her mines open to French exploitation, put French advisors over her affairs, and forbade her from buying so much as a bullet anywhere but Paris. The king exploded. "Do you mean to annex my kingdom?" And then that very same night, because he had no food and no choice, he signed it anyway and sat through the celebration banquet with a face like a gutter in the rain. Sardinia had given France a princess and promised France its own ancestral homeland to win this war, and its reward was to be devoured whole by the friend it had bled for. And Rossini, my beautiful, honest, dangerous Rossini, was about to hand me the other half of the gift, and he did it believing the whole time that he was winning. I had ordered my general to stop chasing him and instead melt away and let him take the city of Varese and let him look like a conqueror. He walked into a shabby little Austrian mayor's office up there, marveling out loud at how rotten and finished the empire looked, and he had no idea that the rot had been staged entirely for his benefit. The Lombard nobles who hated me flocked to him, an old pardoned rebel, a magnetic countess in black who ran the whole conspiracy from her salon, and they pushed him toward the decision he was already leaning into. His deal to hand a freed Italy to the king of Sardinia had only ever been a spoken promise, no signature, and these Republicans wanted no king at all. And they had guns now, because a captured Austrian train had conveniently been left sitting at Varese station, stuffed with 20,000 muskets that somehow nobody had troubled to destroy. That was my train, that was my bait. And Rossini, armed by me, courted by the very nobles I was already writing down for the noose, stood up in front of everyone and proclaimed the rebirth of a republic. Long live the Republic of Sandante, and split himself clean and forever off from the kingdom of Sardinia. I had armed a republic for the express and sole purpose of stabbing a kingdom. My enemies now had two Italies that hated each other, one of them starving and mortgaged to France, the other flying a Republican flag that France would never in 1,000 years tolerate. And I had not fired a single shot to make it happen. I had simply handed each proud man precisely the rope he was already straining to reach, and then I stepped back and let gravity play the villain. Which brings me to the strangest thing I did in the whole war, the thing that had my own capital city howling for my head on a pike. I gave away Milan, on purpose, and then I built the men who took it into gods, so that when they fell, it would be biblical. Here is the machinery of it, because this is the piece I am proudest of. When Louis threw his weight against my river line, I let his weakest army, Prince René's fifth, the one even Louis privately thought was garbage, break through first. I left exactly one bridge unblown at a town called Pavia, a gift, an open door, so that the single least impressive general in the entire French army could march through it and believe he had conquered something. And my troops did not fight for Milan. They boarded trains and rolled east in perfect order, blowing the railways to rubble behind them, and left the city sitting there like an unlocked house with the lamps left burning. Jerome's army walked into Milan without firing a shot, to flowers and cheering crowds, and tricolor flags hanging from the balconies, a welcome parade that I had let a bought Lombard noble organize, and the French lay down that night in beds they hadn't earned, certain they were invincible, and my propaganda machine went straight to work making them believe it harder. I had newspapermen on my payroll writing that the French had blitzed to Milan in 7 days, faster than the great Louis himself had ever moved, that Prince René was a god of war reborn. There is a staged photograph from those days that I genuinely treasure. Fat, gasping Jerome posed beside a cannon with a saber in his fist, pretending he had personally commanded the guns, running under a headline crediting him with thousands of captures. The real number of prisoners was mostly men who had surrendered without a fight, and I will get to exactly why they surrendered, because it is the cruelest trick in the whole sequence. But understand what I was doing. I was inflating my enemies into legends, because the taller you build a god, the farther he has to fall, and I already knew, to the inch, exactly how far Jerome was going to fall, all the way. I just did not yet know that it would be an accident. Now, those surrenders. When Jerome broke through at Pavia, a whole brigade of my own troops gave up almost without a fight, and Vienna read it as a humiliating collapse. It was the precise opposite. I had personally, deliberately, salted that unit with the Lombard and Venetian regiments, the men whose loyalty I most doubted, and left them square in the path of the French breakthrough, on purpose. It was a loyalty test written in live fire. The Venetians surrendered in a body, their own commander defecting along with them, and in doing so they told me, for free, exactly which of my subjects I could never trust again, and the Lombard brigade standing right beside them, handed the identical chance to run, fought instead to the last man. Now I knew. I had spent a defeat to buy the one thing an emperor can never get an honest answer to in peacetime, which of my people will actually die for me, and which will bolt at the first open door. The general who had held that line came to me afterward, weeping with rage, certain I had thrown his men away for nothing, and I told him the whole truth, and I promoted him to corps commander, and I doubled the compensation for every one of his dead. He had been running my experiment without knowing it. The results were worth a city, because here is what the French found when they finally finished celebrating in Milan: nothing to eat. Prometheus. Every granary in the city stripped down to the bare boards weeks before, the telegraph lines cut, and exactly one fragile rail line feeding a starving metropolis and an army of 100,000 men. They had captured a beautiful, rich, empty trap. The jaws took a few days to close, but they closed hard. Bread that had cost a few coins before the war climbed past 200. The liberators started squeezing grain out of the local nobles, and then those same nobles got plundered a second time by their own Sardinian allies, and then a third time by starving French soldiers dressed up as bandits, and some of those Sardinian looters, if you listened closely to them, spoke with a distinctly Venetian accent because a handful of them were mine, out there stoking the fire in a borrowed coat. By the time it was finished, every living soul in Lombardy, the peasant, the priest, the noble in his plundered manor, the mother who could not buy a loaf for her children, hated the men who had come to set them free, and they had begun, very quietly, to miss the emperor under whom, whatever else had been true, they had not gone hungry. That was always the plan. You cannot make people love you, but you can arrange, with great care, for them to experience the alternative and then arrive. Vienna, of course, knew none of this, and Vienna turned on me. 3 straight defeats, my own victory on the Po retroactively spun into a loss by editors I didn't yet own, and even my loyal monarchist newspapers began running the one headline no emperor ever wants to read over his morning coffee. Is the emperor to blame? The editors who ran that one had a curious way of vanishing shortly after my intelligence men dropped by their offices for a friendly cup of tea, but the mood on the street was real, and it was the exact mood I needed, because a certain banker was reading those very same papers and pouring himself a celebratory drink. David Goldstein sat in his mansion with his sharp-eyed son and his fat cronies and toasted my run of defeats. A good defeat, he called it. The French are invincible. Now the government must come crawling to us on its knees. His son, cleverer than his father and worried about it, warned him that Otto and Steiner and Maximilian were not the amateurs of last year, and David waved it away. No one is ever certain of anything, he said, until the very last moment. He was right about that part. He simply had the last moment pointed the wrong way, and then I lit the fuse I had been saving all this time. I had my agents leak the secret treaty, the Plombieres deal, Mazzini's quiet sale of Nice and Savoy to France, into a crowded tavern, out of the loud mouth of a planted drunk, aimed squarely at Rossini's own supply officer. Within a single day it was screaming off every front page in Turin and Genoa. Your sacred, indivisible Italy has already been sold. Nice and Savoy signed away to a foreign emperor by your own prime minister, behind your back. The students went berserk in the streets. Sardinia, the kingdom that was supposed to be uniting Italy, stood exposed to the whole peninsula as the kingdom that had quietly auctioned pieces of it off for hired bayonets. And the man born in Nice, the most beloved patriot in the entire country, the one I had so carefully armed and fed and inflated into a living legend that man was about to learn that everything he had ever bled for was a receipt somebody else had already cashed. I had set every last one of them against each other. Now I only had to survive the battle where they would all come to kill me at once, and they were marching, all of them, on Brescia. But a battle is not won in the week the guns fire. It is won in the quiet months before it, in 3 or 4 small things that nobody ever writes a ballad about, and the biggest of those small things broke my heart a little, and I think it ought to break yours too. The first small thing was my wife catching a traitor with a necklace. Alara had taken up her assignment, find out whether the Empire's beloved commoner hero was rotten, and she did it the only way she possibly could. She invited the man's wife to tea, and over the teacup she happened to notice that the little daughter was wearing an exquisite gold pendant, far, far too fine for an honest quartermaster's salary, and she admired it lightly and asked where such a lovely thing had come from. A gift, the wife said, easily, from a dear family friend, a Mr. Levy. And that was it. That was the entire thread. My Alara, whom the whole world believed to be a sad and delicate beauty, who liked her horses, had just tied the Empire's quartermaster general to the Empire's most dangerous banker with a single soft question at a tea party, and the men she was hunting never once felt the blade slide in. The second small thing was a fire I let burn on purpose. The exiled Hungarian revolutionary Batthyány had resurfaced, backed now by a vengeful France, and he was working his way toward my armies to call every Hungarian soldier serving in them to desert. And my banker, David, needing his own leverage, was secretly arranging to smuggle guns to the Hungarian nobles, to spark a revolt that he could then turn around and sell the government a solution to. 2 enemies coming from 2 opposite directions, both of them working to light the very same fuse under Hungary. And when my aide asked, nervously, whether we ought to move to stop it, I told him no. Add fuel to it. The Hungarian nobles dodged their taxes and dreamed of secession anyway. I would far, far rather they rose now, while I had the whole army in the field and the pretext sitting ready in my hand, than in 10 years, when it might actually succeed. Let them light it. I would decide when it went off. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from having read the ending of the book, and I will freely admit it made me reckless with other people's fuses. And the third small thing, the one that mattered most of all, the one I still turn over in my head at night, was a bowl of stew. The night before everything, out at the first defense line beyond Brescia, I went out alone, in a plain coat, with not one soul knowing that the Emperor walked among them, and I sat down at a campfire with a handful of exhausted sentries, and I ate exactly what they ate. Understand that I had been eating schnitzel and chocolate pancakes a week before. What these men had, at the end of a day spent digging trenches in the mud, was a thin stew, a few beans, a little potato, 3 flecks of meat if a man was lucky, and bread so sour and so gritty that it fought you on the way down. I very nearly choked on it, and I asked, keeping my voice easy and idle, why the food was like this, when I happened to know for a fact that the army bought good rations, and they told me a noble logistics officer was skimming the supplies and selling them off, and had been for years, and any soldier who dared complain about it got broken for it, because you cannot touch a man of that birth. I sat there with that sour bread turning in my mouth, and I made a promise to myself in front of that fire that this man was going to learn, personally and soon, that his blood meant absolutely nothing to me. Then I asked them the question I had really come out into the dark to ask: why did you join? Why are you here, freezing, eating this, waiting to die for a flag? And one by one, they told me, and not a single one of them said glory. An old sergeant said the food had been good, once, 8 years ago, and he'd been chasing that one memory ever since. A father of 7 said his little plot of land couldn't feed his children, and he was still paying off the debt he'd been handed on the very day they told him he was a free man. A Polish boy said his family had lost their land to that same debt, so he and his brother had both enlisted for the death pension. Sit with that one. 2 brothers signing their names so that if one of them died, the family might finally have something. An orphan said the army was simply the only place on earth that filled his stomach. These were the men that all of Vienna and all of Europe called the finest army on the continent. And they had come here not for the empire, but because the empire had already taken everything else they had, and this, their own bodies at 5 florins a month, was the very last thing they had left to sell. I stopped performing then. I dropped the easy, idle voice, and I told them, and I meant every single syllable of it, that I was going to give them land, real land, their own, and that I was going to build them an empire in which no one, not one living soul, ever again went to his bed hungry. And the old sergeant looked at me, this strange, clean-shaven man at his fire making impossible promises into the dark, and I asked him whether he thought he could believe in a thing like that, and he said, how could we not? He didn't even know he was speaking to the one man alive who could actually make it true. He just wanted so badly, so simply, to be allowed to hope. I do not put a joke on top of that one. Some fires you just sit at. But I will give you the sequel because I keep my word, and the timing on this one was perfect. A few days later, with the trenches nearly finished and the very same men grumbling that of course the fancy stranger had forgotten them, of course nothing would ever come of it, a whistle blew, and a feast rolled up the line. Mutton and beef broth, smoked meat, sausages, fresh warm bread, as much as any man could hold, and every soldier was told the exact same thing as it was ladled out. Compliments of the emperor. Grown men who had eaten sour crusts their entire lives wept openly over bowls of soup. The cynic who had sworn nothing would come of it ate his own words along with 3 full helpings. And the roar that went up off that trench line, "Long live the emperor," was not the hollow parade ground kind. It was the kind you get exactly once, from men who have just learned, with their own eyes, that a promise made to them in the dark was real. I had bought something that night that David Goldstein with all his mountains of gold could never buy and never even understood was for sale. Those men were mine now, not the empire's. Mine. And in about 72 hours, I was going to need every one of them to hold a wall against the largest army that Europe had assembled since Waterloo. So let us talk about the wall, and the trap behind the wall, and the day I walked back from the dead. Because here is the thing my enemies still did not know, the thing that every single one of my defeats had been staged, from the very beginning, to hide. I was not dying in Venice. There was no coma. That had been the body double all along, the Venice barber whose face I had shaved my own beard to match, propped up in my bed, coughing on cue for the benefit of every spy in the palace, while the real me was out here at the front in a plain coat running a war on foot. I had played dead. On purpose. For weeks. I had made my own mother and my own wife and my own ministers act frightened and lost, on cue, on a public stage, so that every conspirator in Europe would lean out over their skis, reaching for an empire they were all certain was falling, and they had, every one of them. David leaned. The Hungarian nobles leaned. The men plotting to put my own brother on my throne leaned. They had all committed themselves, on paper, in ink, to a corpse, and the corpse was about to sit up and read out their names. And while they leaned, I had very quietly concentrated nearly my entire army. Understand the real numbers, the ones the enemy did not have. 200,000 combat troops dug in at Brescia, 40,000 more sitting in the great fortresses. And, this is the one that mattered, 110,000 elite regulars, my old eastern border army, freed at last by the deal with Russia, and marched secretly west through the northern Alps, dressed up as ordinary Bohemian units, slipping right past the enemy's spy in Venice, who was busy watching the wrong roads. 110,000 men that Louis did not know existed, sitting in the mountains just north of the battlefield, waiting. The best of the Sardinian generals had a bad, crawling feeling about it. He kept telling the others that all of this smelled like a trap, that Austria might be hiding a whole army somewhere, and his own side kept telling him to relax. Their mole would have warned them if that much force had moved. Their mole was watching the wrong door. I walked into the Brescia City Hall in front of my assembled generals, alive, healthy, beard or no beard entirely unmistakable, and I watched grown men who had been told I was dying in Venice go absolutely white, and then roar it out at the ceiling, "Long live the emperor," because the ghost they had been quietly mourning had just strolled in to take personal command of the biggest battle of any of their lives. And I told them my goal, and it was not what any of them expected. I did not want to annihilate the French. I had no way on earth to run down a broken army in 1859, no trucks, no way to turn a rout into an extinction. I wanted to hit them one time, so catastrophically, soul-shatteringly hard, that Louis II would sit himself down and beg me for peace. One single blow. That was the entire war. But before the blow, I had a mess to clean up, and I want to walk you through exactly how I cleaned it, because it is the coldest, cleverest thing I did in the whole campaign, and it began with a betrayal in the rain. Bathyani's call to desert had finally quietly caught. On one stormy night, a Hungarian captain, a man whose own father had been hanged as a rebel back in 1848, and who therefore had honest human reasons for his hatred, I will grant him that much, rallied about 100 Hungarian soldiers to defect to the enemy, but not all of them wanted to fight their old comrades. A decent lieutenant named Nagy led a group who only wanted to leave quietly, not to kill, and the captain tricked them along, and when Nagy would not cross the line into murdering the sentries, the captain's men turned their guns on Nagy and his loyalists, cut down by the very men they had trusted in the dark for the crime of having a conscience. Most of that honest group did not make it out, but a few of them dragged their wounded through the storm to my army's own aid station and begged the doctors to save them. And that told me everything I needed to know about who they truly were. I did two things with that. The first was mercy, and it was also strategy. Nagy lived, and when I came to see him, he tried to take all of the blame onto himself to spare his men, and I refused to be cheaply, sentimentally lenient. A traitor who walks free for nothing only teaches your loyal men that loyalty is for suckers, but I offered him a trade. Live. Be my public example of a man redeemed. Give me the names of the whole network, and your men go free, all of them. He swore himself to me on the spot. I had turned a deserter into an informant and a lesson, both in a single hour. The second thing I did was the master stroke. My secret police arrested Bathiani's actual inside man, and the officer who made that arrest was Heinrich, my campfire soldier, the father of 7, now a lieutenant, his loyalty bought with a hot meal and a promotion and a promise about land. And then I took the entire ugly truth of the last several months, the rotten rations, the skimmed supplies, the defeats, the treason, and I wrapped every bit of it up into one enormous, satisfying story, and I handed that story to the army. It was all, I told them, the work of a single vast conspiracy. Hungarian traitors and corrupt nobles and greedy bankers, all of them working together, stealing your food, selling off your supplies, engineering your defeats, and blaming the whole thing on your benevolent emperor. I had the confessions photographed. I had the ration thief, that noble officer who had been selling my soldiers meat for years, arrested and paraded through the camp as a member of the ring. I put a bounty on informers, and the soldiers ate it up, cheering, because now the sour bread and the lost battles had a face, and the face was not mine. It was the men in the fine houses. No wonder we starved while that fat officer got rich, they said to each other. The emperor is wise. In one single stroke, I had branded every internal enemy I owned, the rebels, the hostile nobles, David's entire banking cartel, as one treasonous conspiracy, made their crimes the tidy explanation for every hardship of the war, and handed myself the legal cover to seize every last one of their estates. David had spent months building a plot against me. I had just turned the very existence of plots into my single most popular weapon. Everything was set. My enemies were leaning out over the edge. My army was fed and loyal and completely certain of exactly who to hate. My hidden 110,000 were in the mountains. And Louis, grieving nothing yet, still utterly convinced that he was winning, was massing 270,000 men to come and break my turtle shell at Brescia. He had even brought home the heavy siege guns to crack my walls with. He was about to lose the person he loved most in all the world in the opening hours, and none of us, not him, not me, saw it coming. It started with a night raid, and I need you to meet the man I sent to lead it because he is one of my absolute favorites and history treated him like garbage. Horthy. The best field general I had, the one who, in the history I'd read, cover to cover, gets handed an impossible battle some years from now, loses it, and burns his own medals in shame, while the well-born aristocrats who set him up walk away without a scratch. I valued him for the exact reason that everyone above him didn't. He was a commoner's kind of soldier, brilliant and blunt and connected to nobody. I gave him a brand new elite unit, the Storm Commandos, 4,500 men carrying the improved breech-loading rifles that fired 3 times as fast as anything the French had, and 100 cannon, more artillery than his entire career had ever been permitted to touch, and I pointed the whole of it at Prince René's sleeping 5th Army. Jerome's men were the perfect target, and here is a detail I love, because it's the kind of thing only I would have known to use. The French recruits had been half-starved for weeks on Sardinia's collapsing supply lines, and a man who does not eat loses his night vision first. My elites, fat on the feasts I'd been throwing them, could see in the dark. Theirs could not. I was about to fight a battle at midnight against an army that had gone blind and did not know it. The commandos went in silent, bayonets blacked over with coal so they wouldn't catch the moonlight, and the first sentry went down without a sound. But a French veteran on the far side of the camp caught a flicker of movement and fired a warning shot, and that is when my colonel gave the order, and the whole night came apart at once. And I want you to hear the exact words he shouted to launch the charge, because they were not about the empire, and they were not about the flag. They were the bounty I had posted, translated into Croatian and Polish and Hungarian so that every man in that mob understood it perfectly, in his own mother tongue. 10 florins for every Frenchman you kill, and if you fall, if you die here tonight, your family gets 100 florins and 10 hectares of land. Land. The exact thing those men had lost to the debt. The exact thing I had promised them at the campfire, dangled now in front of their eyes at the very instant of the charge. And they went in screaming for the emperor, and for the shining florins, and for their family's happiness, all 3 at the same time, because I had finally, at last, built an army that was fighting for something it actually wanted. The barrage was a horror, and I'll describe it, because it is what a modern idea does to men who are not ready for it. 100 guns opened at once. 100. Some of them, the very same heavy siege pieces we had captured off the French themselves, now turned around and aimed at a camp full of sleeping men who thought they had won the war a week ago. The colonel running that artillery was a strange and gentle soul, a lover of music, a man who read novels between salvos, and who conducted his batteries the way a maestro conducts an orchestra, calling the timing, bringing sections in and out, walking the fire methodically across the field from one end of the camp to the other. It tells you something true about what a war makes of a man, that the most beautiful mind on that whole field was the one aiming the heaviest guns. The tents came apart. Men who had gone to sleep drunk and hungry woke to the ground itself detonating, and there is no drill on earth for that, no square to form, no bayonet that answers a shell. And while the front of the camp died under the guns, and every French officer's instinct dragged him forward to organize a defense at the front, my storm commandos came in from the rear, in French uniforms, from the safe direction, unchallenged, rolled a grenade into a sleeping company, and then opened up all at once with those breech loaders, so fast, so continuously, that in the dark a few hundred men sounded like several whole regiments arriving. The French did not know they were being raided by a small team. They thought they were being overrun from behind, and they broke that way, running toward the shells to escape the phantoms. Then the firebombs, the Molotovs which my commandos had loved since Alessandria. The whole rear of the camp became a lake of clinging flame that no man could beat out, and a powder wagon caught and went up in a mushroom of fire that lit the clouds orange. Jerome's Fifth Army, the invincible legend that my own newspapers had spent 3 weeks building into a god of war, was gutted, top to bottom, in under an hour. Horthy watched it, judged it enough, and calmly walked his guns backward to cover his own retreat the way a professional quietly leaves a room he has finished with. A clean, total, devastating success. With one flaw, he reported to me afterward, genuinely annoyed about it. We failed to capture the enemy general. He had not failed to capture him. He had done something that nobody ordered, and nobody on earth could have planned. Because while the camp burned, Jerome's one sober officer had thrown ice water in the drunk prince's face, jammed his hat on backward, and bundled him into a carriage to flee toward the main army. And that carriage, in the pitch dark, hit a fresh shell crater and stalled, right in the middle of another of my ambush teams, under a colonel named Arthur, who saw a luxurious coach with far, far too many guards around it, and made the obvious professional deduction. Big carriage, many guards, big fish. He did not know who was inside it. He simply knew that it mattered. He ordered the infantry guns onto it. Canister shot and firebombs, and the carriage came apart, and through the smoke another French officer was screaming that it was over, that the prince was dead. Withdraw, withdraw. Prince René, Louis's own cousin, the god of war that my propaganda had invented out of nothing, the man I had deliberately fed into the front of the war so that all the world could watch him rise, was dead in a ditch, killed by a colonel who genuinely believed he was shooting at a paymaster's coach. My men picked a cheap, worn pocket watch off the body, the single, unfancy thing on an over-decorated corpse, and found a small family photograph tucked inside the case, and they brought it to me, because they knew a keepsake like that meant that somebody important had died. I held that watch for 10 full minutes without saying one word, and I will be honest with you about why, because it is the one moment in this whole campaign that the mask came off when nobody was attacking me. I looked at the little family photograph inside a dead man's watch, and I thought about the family photograph I used to carry, in another century, in a body that was mine, before the universe filed me into this one. Some grief does not care in the slightest whose side you are on. Then I did my job. I recognized the faces, Jerome, and beside him his cousin Louis II, and their father, and a princess who ran half of Paris, and I understood, with a cold drop straight through the floor of my stomach, exactly what had just happened to my careful, patient, everything according to plan war. I had been luring Louis, baiting him along gently, letting him feel clever. That was over now. The most powerful man in Europe had just lost the person he loved most in the world to my army, in the dark, by pure accident, and there would be no more luring, because a grieving man does not need to be lured. He comes on his own, with everything he has, and he does not stop. I turned to my engineers and told them to reinforce the Brescia walls past all reason, unlimited brick, unlimited cement, and test them by shelling them with our own captured siege guns until we were dead certain they would hold. Because Louis II was going to throw his entire soul at those walls now, and I had just barely enough time left to make sure they were ready to break his heart against them. I had wanted a war that ended with a handshake. I was about to get one that ended with a manhunt. And just as the French were preparing to come at me in a blind fury, I finished the very last piece of the trap I had been building for months. It was not military, it was diplomatic, and it was aimed at the back of Louis's neck. Prussia signed. My old envoy in Vienna, a 72-year-old lion of a diplomat, closed the deal I had been steering toward from the day I first opened my eyes. North Germany would be Prussia's to organize. South Germany would be mine. And, this is the part that mattered, Prussia would attack France's border provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, within 2 days. So count the board now. Russia, secretly mine. Britain, sidelined and broke. Prussia, about to plunge a knife into France's back. The fatal isolation that had doomed Austria in the history I'd read was simply gone. Reversed. Turned inside out. And I had buried a little blade inside the Prussian deal too, just for the future. Russia had agreed to recognize my South German Empire, but never Prussia's northern one. Prussia was about to bleed for a prize that the rest of Europe would never, ever let it keep. But that is a problem for a much later episode. Meanwhile, the fuse I had lit under Hungary finally reached the powder, and I will be honest with you about the ugliest thing that came out of it because I set the conditions and I will not pretend otherwise. In Zagreb, a Croatian official hungry to carve out his own power in the chaos hosted a banquet for the city's nobility. And while they were all secretly meeting Batthyani upstairs, that man's soldiers walked into the dinner and killed everyone at the table. 157 of them, the entire aristocracy of a city, shot dead at its own supper, to be blamed on the rebels and clear the board for one man's ambition. Even Batthyani, who had seen a great deal of blood in his life, looked at what his new ally had done and called him a lunatic to his face. I heard about it 2 days later, and I thought of St. Bartholomew's Day, of the nights in history when a whole class dies between the courses. I had wanted Hungary to rise so that I could crush it with a clear conscience. I had not wanted that. But you do not get to light a fire and then choose which houses it takes, and I had known that when I struck the match, so I banked the horror and I used it, because that is the job, because Hungary rose. The telegram came in, and I am told I smiled, which is not to my credit, and I said that the prey had fallen into the trap. My generals actually crossed themselves, and then I gave them a masterclass, because a revolt is only a disaster if you fight it with soldiers alone. Hungary was barely a third Magyar. The rising would stay penned in 2 districts while the rest of the country sat on its hands and watched. So instead of just marching in, I fired a salvo of reforms designed to saw the rebels clean off at the root. Open competitive examinations for the civil service. Any man of any people could now rise on merit, except the rebels and their children, who were barred from every office and every bank forever. Forgiveness of the crushing land debt for any peasant who stayed loyal, which split the farmers clean away from the nobles who were leading them. Rewards for everyone who helped put it down. Confiscation for everyone who did not. I was not going to defeat Hungary. I was going to make being a Hungarian rebel the loneliest job in all of Europe. And in Vienna, my moderates walked into the net at the very same hour. My minister Schiller had been stringing along the reasonable Hungarian delegation for days, tea and tax arithmetic, until the second rebellion broke out and the interior troops came through the door, because one of that very delegation, a charming count named Esterházy, had just slipped away to run to the rebels, which proved the whole moderate mission had been cover from the start. One delegate leapt clean out of a second-floor window. Their leader cursed my minister all the way to hell in Hungarian, and my minister smiled and said he was terribly sorry he didn't speak the language. In one single afternoon, I had swept up the radicals and the moderates together, and the very last man loose was Esterházy, running for the border in the dark. You need to know who Esterházy was to Alara. Not a stranger, a friend. One of the handsome, laughing Hungarian nobles she had raced horses with, back when she was a lonely empress, and they were the only people at that whole cold court who ever made her feel alive. He was her friend. And he had used it, used her trust, used the things she had told him on those long, careless rides, to serve a rebellion. And she caught him herself, and the way she did it is the whole story of who she had become. Every decoy Esterházy sent out, my people ran down. 3 separate men disguised as him, taken on 3 separate roads, one of them biting down on a poison capsule and dying with "Long live Hungary" on his lips rather than be captured. But the real Esterházy was going a way that not one of my intelligence men had thought to watch, except Alara had thought to watch it, because she remembered. Years before, on some bright and careless afternoon, when she was still just the lonely young empress, and he was the charming friend who made her laugh, they had been racing their horses, and he had shown off, and told her which back road was the fastest way to Pest. He had handed her the map to his own escape, to impress a girl, and never once imagined that she would keep it. So on a moonlit country road, with his fresh horses collapsing under him because her people had reached the relay first and seen to them, Count Esterházy found himself ringed by gendarmes and hussars, and out of the dark, in riding clothes, stepped the Empress of Austria herself. The other men taken with him were her old friends too, the whole laughing set she'd ridden with, and one of them looked at her and spat that they had only ever tolerated her for her title, that she was a selfish, boring woman, that not one of them had ever meant a single word of it. She did not flinch. She had already learned, in that room full of intelligence files, exactly what her friendships had really been worth to the men she had given them to. She looked past him, at Esterházy, and she asked him one thing, quietly, almost gently. "Are we friends?" And Esterházy, clever, charming, cornered, bowed to her the way he had bowed 100 times in 100 ballrooms, and he said, "Of course, my dear Empress," and reached inside his coat for the weapon hidden there. Her spymaster screamed a warning, and Alara, the sad beauty, the woman the whole continent had spent years underestimating, the wife the real Otto had left alone in a palace to slowly wither, drew the pistol she was carrying and shot him dead, herself, before his hand ever cleared his coat. No hesitation, no trembling. She looked down at the body of the man who had been her friend, and she holstered the gun, and she said in a voice like the first hard frost of winter, "Take them all away." And then she stood there a moment, looking up at the sky, and she said the line that told me everything about who she had become and exactly what it had cost her. "Isabella," she said, "the moon tonight is truly beautiful. I miss Otto a little." That is the woman that history remembers for her hair. She executed a friend who had betrayed her on a dark road with her own hand, and then she thought of me. I was going to spend the rest of both our lives making certain she never had to be that alone again. But first, I had a battle to win, and Louis, wild with grief, was at last walking straight into my trap. There is one thing about the Battle of Brescia you have to hold on to, because it is the whole reason I came to this century instead of quietly enjoying the pancakes. In the history I'd read, the real one, the one where I never woke up in this bed, this exact war ended a few miles from here, at a place called Solferino, and Austria lost, catastrophically. And that single defeat started the avalanche that buried the empire and everyone in it I had decided to save. Brescia was Solferino, with the sign flipped. Everything I had done for 6 weeks, the burned depot, the stripped province, the fed soldiers, the hidden 110,000, the god I'd built out of Prince René, every bit of it existed to turn the worst day in the history of Austria into its best one. And it worked, right in front of my eyes. It began with the Sardinians dying for nothing, and even I felt it. Louis, grieving and enraged, seized the Sardinian army outright, demoted their generals, put French overseers behind them with orders, and drove the starving Sardinian boys in frontal charges straight into my killing ground. The barbed wire, the zigzag trenches, the craters my own captured siege guns had already dug, and now the fast-firing breech loaders sitting on top of all of it. They came in waves, and they died in waves, hungry, watching the French eat behind them, sent forward to soak up my ammunition with their own bodies. And the thing about men pushed exactly that far is that eventually they break the right way. At a pre-battle speech, a Sardinian officer shot one of his own men dead in a scuffle over the sheer injustice of it, and a sergeant whose own father had died years ago fighting Austria on these very plains, put a bullet in that officer, and turned to the ranks and said the single truest sentence of the whole war. "Let's go to the Austrians, at least over there, we eat." And then 1,000 of them did. A tide of starving Sardinian conscripts came across the open ground with their white shirts waving from their rifle barrels, the first mass surrender of the war, and my colonel on that sector held his fire and instead shelled the French overseers behind them to cover the men coming in. I got the photograph, emaciated boys weeping over bowls of rice and chicken, and I did what I do. I weaponized it. I printed leaflets, heavy on the pictures for the ones who couldn't read, the French feasting safe in the rear, the Sardinians starving and dying at the front, and a simple little map of where the food was. And then, and I am a little proud of this one, I had my cook set up great pots of rich meat stew and boil them upwind of the enemy lines, so that the smell of a hot meal drifted right across the trenches to men who had not eaten in days. You have never in your life seen a recruitment poster work the way the smell of stew works on a starving army. They came over in droves. I was disarming my enemy with soup, but Louis, I wanted, and he handed himself to me, because grief makes even clever men predictable. When his southern attacks stalled against my trenches, he did the prideful thing. He moved himself, and his elite Imperial Guard, and his heaviest siege guns, down to that front to force the breakthrough in person. And the very instant my general on that sector saw the Imperial flag move, saw that the Emperor of the French had personally walked into the one corner of the board I most controlled, he nearly laughed out loud, and he started planning not a defense but a capture. I posted the bounty myself, 5 florins a soldier, 500 for a general, and a hereditary title of nobility for whichever of my men brought me the Emperor of the French, alive. So we let him in. My troops abandoned the forward trenches and pulled back into hidden bunkers, and the French charged a position that, as far as they could see, had simply been given up. There is a French sergeant in this story who face-planted into an empty trench, came up clutching a startled mouse, looked around at the total absence of any enemy at all, and yelled, "There's no one here!" A French flag went up over my captured first line at the cost of exactly 0 casualties, and the French cheered, and behind them my general watched every bit of it and said very quietly, "Now the counterattack begins." Because the trenches were not empty, they were bait, and I'd had them soaked in oil. Picture the French in that captured line, cheering, planting flags, congratulating each other on cracking the famous Austrian turtle shell at last, and then somebody notices his boots are sliding, that the dirt underfoot is dark and slick and smells wrong, that the walls of the trench are greased, and in the half-second it takes a clever man to understand what that means. It is already far too late, because I had 100 and more heavy guns pre-ranged onto that exact ground, every big gun I owned, sighted days in advance on a position I had built with my own engineers precisely so that I would know its range to the inch, and all of them fired at once. The shells came down, and the oil caught, and the line the French had captured turned into a trench full of fire with the French army standing inside it. They had charged into an oven and pulled the door shut behind themselves and called it a victory. Louis did the correct thing, the textbook thing. He ordered his own artillery forward to answer mine. And that was the second jaw of the trap, because the very instant those famous French guns rolled out of cover into the open to deploy, my hidden batteries opened up, camouflaged emplacements I had sighted for exactly this moment, and they caught a third of the French artillery in the open and wrecked it before it could fire a single shot in reply. And that, they tell me, is the moment the little emperor's face went gray. The moment the man who had come to break me finally understood the shape of the thing he was standing inside, and said the two words out loud to no one. It's a trap. Then the ground opened, and my infantry came out of it. Out of hidden bunkers, dug deep beneath the very trench line the French believed they had taken, fresh, well-fed, well-rested men, far more of them than the enemy had counted in his worst estimate, a great many of them carrying those breech loaders that fired 3 shots for everyone a French musket could manage. They came up out of the earth on every side of an enemy that was already burning and already reeling, and it stopped being a fight between equals and became a machine doing its work. And when the Sardinians were thrown forward to plug the collapsing gap, the Sardinians took one single look at the firestorm and the men rising out of the ground and did the only sane thing left to a starving conscript. They routed on sight, threw down their muskets, and ran straight for my lines with their hands up, because at least over there they would be fed. Now the whole French main force was being wrapped up, a fresh corps of mine closing the ring from a town on the flank, exactly where I had placed it, exactly for this, and a scout came sprinting to Louis with the news that the jaws were shutting, that the Emperor of the French himself was about to be surrounded in a burning field in a country that was not his own. His own guard commander did not argue with him. He seized his emperor bodily and forced him into a carriage, because a captured Louis means a fallen France, and every man there knew it, and Louis II fled for Milan with the ruin of his army behind him, while his magnificent imperial guard turned around and stayed to die in the gap, buying the road with their bodies so their emperor could run. At sunset, 2,000 of my lancers in their rain-soaked white coats caught the shattered remnant in the open, where they could not form square, and after that it was not a battle, and I will not pretend it was. And far away on the eastern edge of the whole vast fight, the French general Massena, the tough old Africa hand, the scarred professional, the one genuinely dangerous commander the enemy had, was killed outright by a cannonball, and what was left of his wing broke for the rear with less than half the men it had started the day with. By dusk it was done, and it was so complete that there was no time and no ground to bury the dead, so we burned them. Tens of thousands on great pyres. And I'll give you this one straight, because it earned it. Soldiers of both armies stood at those fires and wept together, French and Austrian and Sardinian, watching men who had been trying to kill each other that very morning burn side by side in the same flames, finally on the same side of something. A bishop blessed it with tears running down his face. War does not care whose flag you fell under. In the end, it files every last one of us under the same single heading. The tally, when my adjutant finally brought it to me, 13,000 of mine dead, 11,000 wounded. And on the other side, more than 20,000 dead and over 40,000 taken prisoner, a French general killed, a Sardinian corps commander captured alive, an entire Allied army broken across 3 simultaneous fights that together made up the thing the history books would now have to find a brand new name for, because the name they had used before was Solferino, and Solferino was a defeat, and this was not. I ordered generous pensions and land for every family that had lost a man, a new standard, written in the very blood I had promised at a campfire never to waste, and a hospital for the crippled, and I told my staff that from this day forward we induced the Sardinians to surrender rather than kill them, because they were going to be my subjects soon, and you do not build a country on top of a graveyard. I had woken up 6 weeks earlier as a man doomed to lose this exact war and everything that came after it, and I had just won it, the largest battle in Europe since Waterloo, and the empire that was supposed to begin dying that day stood instead on the field, in the smoke, counting its prisoners. Now I only had to collect what the victory was worth, and make a grieving emperor, and a broken kingdom, and one very confident banker each understand, one at a time, exactly what it costs to be on the wrong side of a man who has read the ending. Let us start with the grieving emperor, because he came apart exactly the way I had known he would, and it began the moment he got back to Milan. He had fled Brescia in that carriage with the ruin of his guard behind him, and he rode into Milan expecting, what? Sanctuary, I suppose. The adoration of the city he'd liberated. Instead, he got the truth. The people of Milan were starving on my account, and they knew whose war had done it, and they came out into the streets and they stoned the emperor of the French. Not with eggs. Eggs were a luxury nobody in that city could spare anymore. They used rocks and paving stones and whatever came to hand, and they screamed at him to get out of their city, and his own guards had to close ranks around the carriage and force it through. Louis II, nephew of the man who conquered Europe, hunched down in a rattling coach while a hungry mob he had ruined threw stones at his window. He is supposed to have said, to no one, that he should simply have extorted money out of Sardinia over the whole Orsini business and never fought this war at all. A little late for that particular insight. And then the news started arriving, and each piece of it was worse than the last. Prussia was across his border, taking his great fortress at Metz. The German Confederation had voted to declare war on France outright and was demanding Alsace and Lorraine. And his own sidelined foreign minister, a man named Cambaceres, who happened to be the first Louis's own illegitimate son and who had been kept carefully outside every one of the secret treaties, delivered the bombshell that broke the little emperor's nerve for good. Russia. Russia had played him. The 150,000 Austrians that Louis had counted on being pinned to the eastern frontier by the threat of the Tsar had never been pinned at all. Alexander had let them go west, to Brescia, to me, because Alexander was mine now, and Louis had never once suspected it. He had walked into a war believing he understood the board, and every square of it had been quietly turned against him while he admired his own mustache. So he made his choice, and it was the only sane one left. His General Bazaine put it to him bluntly, the way only a soldier can. Do you truly intend to shed the last drop of French blood for Sardinia? And Louis did not. He decided to save his own throne, his own skin, his own France, and to throw Sardinia overboard entirely. He sent Cambaceres to me at Brescia with a letter suing for peace, and he recalled his armies, and he abandoned the kingdom that had bled for him, cleanly and completely, the very instant the water turned rough. The kingdom that had handed France a princess, that had promised France its own ancestral homeland. Its reward for all of it was to be dropped over the side and left to drown. Mazzini had warned his king to his face that any ally can betray you. Look at how Austria stabbed Russia in the Crimea, he'd said. He had just watched it happen to himself from a distance of about 6 inches, and there was nothing left to do about it. In Turin, meanwhile, the king of Sardinia fainted dead away when they brought him the telegram from Brescia, simply collapsed. Out of 60,000 men, he'd had 120, and when he came to, he would not hear a word of surrender. Mazzini, clever, exhausted, watching the walls come down around him, begged the man to sue for peace while there was still a kingdom left to save. But the king and his war minister insisted on fighting on. They still held half of Lombardy on paper. They still had Rossini's 2 fresh divisions somewhere in the north, and France as an ally, and the hope of revolts breaking out in my rear. The king swore he would expose Louis's true face to the whole world and raise fresh taxes and fight to the last Sardinian. It was the courage of a man who has already lost and cannot yet make himself say the word. Mazzini knew it. You could see it in him. He started quietly, making arrangements for the end. And in the middle of all that collapse, there was one person in the whole Sardinian royal house who had gone very, very cold and very, very clear. And you need to meet her now, because she is going to matter enormously. Princess Augusta, the king's own daughter. The one who had been married off to the now dead Prince René, handed across as the literal price of the French alliance. The political bride, who had hated every second of it and never once pretended otherwise. She was part Habsburg on her mother's side, and after everything her family had done to her and everything her mother had suffered before her, something in her had simply finished. When her father came to her with the good news that Jerome was dead, freeing her, she did not thank him. She looked at him, and she called him the King of Sardinia, not father, and she told him flatly that she was Augusta of Habsburg now. She had taken to reading Rousseau in her rooms. Man is born free and is everywhere in chains. And she said things to the king about his mistresses, and hinted at things about how her own mother had really died that made him go pale and then furious. So he locked her in her rooms, his own daughter, imprisoned in the palace while his kingdom burned. She let him do it. She was waiting for something, and she was patient, and I was, without either of us knowing it yet, exactly the thing she was waiting for. But before Turin, before the princess, I had to win over the one great power still standing on the fence, and I did it in a muddy Lombard village, with a piece of theater I had staged down to the last kneeling peasant. Britain sent an envoy to see the truth for itself, Lord Palmerston, a careful, skeptical man, and I made very sure of exactly what truth he saw. I had deliberately slowed my victorious army to a crawl so that it could run food relief through the liberated villages. My own adjutant thought I had lost my mind, halting a winning campaign to go and hand out soup. And I met Lord Palmerston in one of those villages, called Trenzane, and I had staged it to the inch. Villagers on their knees in the road, weeping, crying, "Long live Otto." I bent down and lifted an old man up out of the mud with my own 2 hands, a man whose sons had been conscripted by Sardinia, whose fields had been looted, one of whose boys was already dead of it, and I held him up and I let the photographers I'd brought catch every second of it for the papers. And then I dismantled the entire idea of Italian unification for Lord Palmerston, right there in the road, and I did it with a language lesson. Palmerston spoke fine, educated, textbook Italian, and he could not understand a single word these Lombard villagers were saying to him, because it was not Italian, it was Lombard, as far from a Sardinian's Tuscan as one nation's tongue is from another's. Italy, my lord, I told him, gesturing at the weeping old man, is a geographical expression. There is no Italian nation. What there is a Sardinian king who taxes and conscripts and loots these people twice as hard as I ever did and calls it their liberation, and I will not stand aside for conspirators who starve my own subjects. And then I simply let the villagers testify. The looting, the forced conscription, the boys marched off and never returned, and their own words did the rest of the work for me. Palmerston had come to Trenzane to take the measure of a tyrant. He left having decided to stand with Austria, because Britain's true nightmare was a Europe run jointly by France and Russia, and I had just shown him, in the flesh, in the mud, that the only real alternative was an Austria whose own conquered peasants ran into the road to bless it. I had flipped the British Empire onto my side, and I had not borrowed a single pound to do it. Palmerston wrote, years afterward, that the day at Trenzane changed the way he saw the common people for the rest of his life. Good. That was precisely what it was built to do. Now let me show you the whole difference between me and Bathiani, because we were both fighting for the future of a conquered people, and we did the exact opposite thing, and it decided everything. Bathiani won his revolution in Budapest and immediately began to kill. He set up a river of public executions along the Danube, pro-Habsburg nobles, officials, priests, anyone caught without sufficient revolutionary enthusiasm, and the bodies went into the river. He passed a decree that made a simple lack of visible zeal a crime. His one lesson from his failed uprising a decade before was that last time he had been too soft, last time he had not killed nearly enough. And the terrible irony of it, the thing that should have saved him and didn't, was that Vienna's rule over Hungary had actually made the common people's lives better. Abolished the internal tariffs, freed the serfs, so that Bathiani's terror was falling hardest on a population that had, on balance, been doing fine. He was manufacturing his own enemies by the thousand. My staff looked at the reports of the massacres and assumed, cheerfully, that the atrocities would turn the people against him and simply hand us Hungary for free. And I told them the cold truth, the one I had learned from a page of history far darker than any of them had ever read. Terror does not lose a man his power. Terror consolidates it. A frightened population obeys and keeps its head down and informs on its neighbors and survives. The purges only ever backfire when some outside force that the regime cannot resist arrives from outside and breaks the spell. And then, all at once, all of those terrified enemies who were only waiting spring back up together. So I did not need to save Hungary from Bathiani's terror. On the contrary, I only needed to be that outside force, to beat his armies a few times in the open field so that the spell broke, and then his own terrified people would tear his government to pieces from the inside, and his end would be far more tragic than any exile. So I abandoned Budapest. It paid me no taxes, it was not worth one soldier, pulled my loyalists safely out, held only the ring of outer fortresses, and let the man drown in the blood he was so eager to spill. And while Bathiani murdered his people, I bought mine. My great reform decree reached down into the villages at last, and a young official would stand up on a cart in a village square and read it out, that every last florin of the crushing land redemption debt, the debt that had turned the freeing of the serfs into a life sentence, the debt that 2 brothers had enlisted and died to escape, was forgiven, cancelled, struck from the books, paid personally by the emperor. And whole villages wept, and got down on their knees in the mud, and roared my name at the sky. My minister Schiller had found the tens of millions of florins to fund it out of the reparations, and my other ministers had seen the propaganda gold in it immediately. Bathiani gave the Hungarian peasant a public execution to stand and watch, I gave him back his farm, free and clear, forever. There was never one single moment's doubt which way that population was going to break. You cannot out-terror a man like Bathiani, and I never once tried. I outfed him. I outforgave him. It is the exact same trick as the stewpots upwind of the trenches, only played now on 12 million souls at once. And back home, my wife was closing the last of the traps herself. It started with a worker named Moretti, a self-taught man of fallen noble blood, sharp as a tack, who had risked his life to get a message to the throne. The great capitalists of Vienna were withholding their workers' wages and doing it in my name for the war effort and pocketing the difference. And when my mother's people pulled that thread, it turned out to be attached to something far uglier than simple theft. One of those factory owners, a man his own workers called the Vampire, was secretly manufacturing bullets and gunpowder in the dead of night and smuggling them out, arming the Hungarian rebels. The wage theft was a footnote. The man was part of David's whole ring, so Alara went to him herself. She walked into that striking ironworks in a silver gown, with a cavalry escort at her back and her spymaster beside her, straight through the gates and past the Vampire's hired thugs, and the workers, who loved her, who arguably loved her more than they loved me, went silent as she passed. She reached the strike leader, and she did not command him. She knelt him back up onto his own feet, and she promised him, personally, that every florin he was owed would be recovered. And then her people hauled in the crates, imperial standard bullets, matching to the grain the muskets that had been stolen from the Hungarian warehouses, and laid the Vampire's treason open on his own factory floor for everyone to see. She had him dragged off to the Interior Ministry. She nationalized his factory on the spot, so that not one worker lost his job, and she paid out the men's stolen back wages, then and there, from chests of imperial florins into their own hands, while they chanted her name until their voices cracked. The sad empress with the beautiful hair had just personally run an arms smuggling ring to ground in the streets of her own capital, and broken it and turned its factory over to the state, and made the whole city adore her doing it. I would truly love to see the file from a single year before, in which any living soul on earth predicted that woman. There was one last thread out of all of it, and it is the sad one, so I will not rush it. My quartermaster general, Killian, the honest commoner that David had trapped years ago, through the medical debt on his own dying daughter, could not go on living with what he had been forced to do to his own army. So he went to an old archbishop, a man who had once been my own teacher, and he confessed all of it, the blackmail, the sabotaged supply lines, month after month, the soldiers who had gone hungry because of orders he had been forced to give. He was too ashamed to bring it to me himself, in the middle of a war he had helped to cripple, so he moved his family into the safety of the palace walls, and he wrote it all down in a letter, and he put the letter into the archbishop's hands to carry to me. I have never, he wrote, in the whole of my life, done one single thing against my own conscience. Now it is time to atone. Hold on to Killian. He is the true human cost of the banker's game, a good man, broken not by his own greed, but by his love for a sick child. And when the hour comes that I finally settle my accounts with David Goldstein, that letter is a line on the bill I intend to collect. Louis, back in Paris now, could not quite bring himself to run for the exit all at once. A defeated emperor is a dead emperor, and he knew it, so he decided to make one last stand at Milan to win himself a dignified peace. He pulled a fresh army down from the safe Pyrenees border and conscripted more men in Sardinia's name and told his generals he would fight one more battle, one that would make Otto regret it. His aide, a cold-eyed man named Leroy, floated the real endgame in a quiet room. Carve up Sardinia together with Austria. France takes Savoy and Nice. Austria takes Genoa. Turin is negotiable. Betray the ally completely and split the corpse. Louis wavered. His advisor Griboval warned him that betraying an ally that openly bought you 30 years of every court in Europe distrusting you, and he put the decision off. After the Battle of Milan, he said, we'll decide after Milan. There was no after Milan. Milan fell, and it fell the way a rotten alliance always falls, from the inside. A Sardinian colonel named Dante, fluent in French and German both, marched his own regiment up as reinforcements to the French line, and then turned every gun he had on the French command post and cut it down where it stood, spitting that they all deserved to go to hell for what they'd done to his country. That single act of betrayal collapsed the whole Milan defense like a row of dominoes. And then Rossini, the man everyone had written off as sulking up in his mountains, came down from the north and closed the other jaw of a pincer, and the entire Franco-Sardinian army found itself surrounded inside the very city it had marched into as conquerors 6 weeks before. Half of them broke out, half of them did not. And in Paris, when Louis got the news that Metz had fallen to Prussia and Milan was lost, he finally said the words, "Our war with Austria ends here." He invited Russia and Britain to mediate, recalled his last general, and abandoned Sardinia to its fate entirely and forever. Let them fend for themselves. The God of War headlines were a lifetime ago now. Now I have to tell you the part I am not proud of, because I promised you at the very start that I would not hide the basement, and here it is. While the armies fought their honest battles out in the daylight, another kind of work was going on in the dark, and I was the one who ordered every bit of it. All across the empire, the men on my list, the bankers and the nobles who had funded the rebels, smuggled the rifles to Croatia, bankrolled the Republicans, worked hand in glove with David to bring the whole thing crashing down, were dying, not in courtrooms. My interior ministry sent out men disguised as pirates, as bandits, as defeated Sardinian stragglers, and they fell upon the traitors' estates in the night, and the traitors and their fortunes simply vanished, and the confiscated gold flowed quietly back into my treasury before the war was even over. I told myself, and I still tell myself, that it was necessary, that you cannot behead a great banking house in an open court without the whole of European finance snapping its purse shut against you forever, so it has to look like the random cruelty of war, and it was necessary, and it was also murder, dressed up as weather, and signed by me. I had woken up in this body promising to cancel funerals, and here I was, a few short weeks later, quietly scheduling them. I do not get to keep only the flattering half of what I did in this century. The man who wept at the campfire and the man who sent pirates to a banker's island are the very same man, and on the day I let myself forget that, I will have become the exact thing that I replaced. Turin was the kingdom's last stand, and it was a genuine tragedy, and I will give it to you straight, because those people earned it. The king of Sardinia had gone half mad by the end, wandering his palace muttering that Sardinia would win, that Savoy was eternal, and in the end his own prime minister, Mazzini, could see no other way to save the state from the man supposed to be saving it, and knocked the king unconscious with a candlestick, tied him up, and shipped him quietly off into exile in London to get him out of the way of the peace. My siege guns came down from Vienna, and I made a decision I will stand behind to my last day. I flattened the walls rather than spend my own soldiers storming them, because a wall can be rebuilt, and a soldier of mine cannot. The countryside surrendered wholesale. The king's own crushing taxes had broken those peasants long before I ever came near them, and most of the Sardinian army got itself out by rail before the ring closed. But not everyone got out. There was a unit of university students, boys, from the University of Turin, left behind in the retreat under a young colonel who had been the top student in his year before the war made a soldier of him. About 100 of them, encircled, with no way out at all, and they chose to charge. Not because it could possibly work, it could not, and it did not, but because, in their young colonel's own words, they wanted the men of centuries from now to remember that they had stood. My breech loaders and my hidden trap pits cut them down to a dozen in the space of a few minutes. And when that last dozen still would not fall, still stood there in the smoke shouting "Long live Sardinia," with their king already tied up in a carriage bound for London, they died on that field for a country that had, as of that very afternoon, ceased entirely to exist. The colonel's note was found on his body afterward. It said only this: loyalty to the homeland until the last moment. I was on the other side of that field. They were fighting me and mine. And I will tell you plainly that I hope somebody, somewhere, remembers those boys, because they meant it more purely than any crowned king in this whole long war ever meant anything at all. Turin fell, and I entered it a few days later, through streets half in rubble, past long silent lines of starving refugees, and I did not feel one thing like a conqueror. I felt the full crushing weight of 500,000 brand new subjects who mostly did not want me, and whose language I had just spent a month telling Lord Palmerston was not even a real language. So I did the only thing that has ever actually worked. Soup kitchens on every corner, bread handed out free, and a flood of leaflets and criers, reframing the entire brutal conquest as a rescue. A rescue from a king who had taxed each family into the ground 3 separate times and then marched their sons off to die for a word, Italy, that had never once meant a single solitary thing on a Lombard farm. If you do not hold the propaganda front yourself, I told my staff, then the enemy will hold it for you. I had learned that lesson the hardest possible way, in a century that none of them would ever live to see, watching great empires lose wars they had already won on the battlefield simply because they let the other side tell the story afterward. Not me. I was going to tell every last story in this war myself, and I was going to tell it first. And then, in the one palace still standing intact at the very heart of that ruined city, I met the single person in all of Sardinia who had actually been waiting for me to arrive, and she handed me the entire kingdom, wrapped up in a bow, on purpose, and for reasons that were entirely and coldly her own. Princess Augusta, the caged one. She had refused flatly to flee with her family when the end came. She was no longer a Savoy, she said, so why in God's name would she run with them? Her servants had stayed loyal to her when every other soul in that palace scattered, which tells you exactly what kind of person she was underneath the court gown, and when I came to her, she knelt. And I braced myself for the usual thing, the tearful plea for mercy, for her life, for her families. It was not that at all. She asked me to save the people of Sardinia, and then, still on her knees, she laid out an offer so sharp that it solved, in a single clean stroke, a problem I had been quietly arguing about with my own cabinet for a solid week. Here was my problem. My hardliners wanted to annex Sardinia outright, swallow the whole kingdom in one gulp and be done with it. My moderates wanted to take an indemnity and a border fortress and leave the rest well alone, because annexing a proud, foreign, hostile kingdom by naked military force is precisely the way you buy yourself 30 years of insurrection and the open contempt of every court on the continent, and I was stuck fast between the two. And this woman, kneeling on the floor of her own father's ruined palace, handed me the way out. She would petition me, publicly, as a princess of the blood of Habsburg with a legitimate claim of her own. She would ask, of her entirely free will, in front of the whole world, for Sardinia to be taken into the Austrian Empire, to save its ruined, overtaxed, abandoned people from the wreckage that her own father had made of them. Not a conquest at all, a rescue, requested freely by the royal house's own blood. The single most perfect legal fig leaf ever laid over an act of raw force, and offered to me, unbidden, by the one person on earth whose request no one alive could call illegitimate. I asked her why, and she told me the plain truth, which is a great deal rarer than you would ever expect from royalty. Part of it was hatred of her father, of what had been done to her mother, whose death she would only ever hint at. And part of it, she said, and I believed her completely, was that she had simply stood at her window and watched these people be taxed and conscripted and looted into their graves for a dream that had never for one instant been theirs, and she could not stand it a single day longer. Vengeance and pity, braided tight together and aimed with real precision at exactly the outcome I most needed. I have built whole campaigns out of far, far less than that. I will admit that she reminded me of Alara, that same quality of a sharp, watching, patient mind that all the men around her had spent years mistaking for nothing more than a pretty face. I called her Sophie, and I invited her to the great peace conference I was about to convene in Vienna, where every king in Europe would gather to carve up the continent, and where a Habsburg princess publicly petitioning for the salvation of her own people would be worth 10 full divisions of infantry to me. My adjutant Gustav, who has, I must tell you, all the delicacy and subtlety of an artillery barrage at close range, took one single long look at the two of us leaving that room together, and asked me, with what he clearly believed was enormous discretion, whether we were finished. I genuinely had no idea on earth what the man meant for a deeply, memorably embarrassing 3 full seconds. Augusta understood him instantly and went scarlet to the very roots of her hair. Some things, it turns out, translate perfectly across every language and every century ever spoken by men, and Gustav's eyebrows are apparently one of them. I had found, if not another Alara, then at the very least another mind well and truly worth keeping close to me, and a signature that was about to make an act of naked conquest look, to all the watching world, like a simple act of mercy. Meanwhile, the very last legs got kicked clean out from under the Hungarian revolt, and Louis, in his flailing, did it to himself. He had promised the Romanians a slice of Transylvania if they would only help the rebels, and their army massed on my eastern border and made ready to link up with a Hungarian general slipping through the mountain passes to take a key fortress city. And then, at the very last possible moment, Bucharest lost its nerve. Louis's priorities had shifted. France was quitting the war. The money and the grand promises had all evaporated into the air, and the Romanian force was recalled home, abruptly, leaving that Hungarian general hanging out alone in the wind, caught between my fortress garrison and my arriving reinforcements. He lost more than half his men and staggered back into a retreat he never recovered from. Bathiani's fury was a thing to behold, screaming to the rafters that the Romanians had broken their sworn word, which was true, and which is also precisely the sort of thing that happens when your entire grand strategy depends on a foreign emperor who has already stopped taking your calls. His terror wound another notch tighter, and he began purging his own minority officers after the wave of defections, and the whole man was visibly, audibly coming apart at the seams. I had told my generals, weeks before, that his government would collapse in on itself under just a few battlefield losses. It was collapsing now, exactly on schedule. You cannot run a revolution on borrowed guns and borrowed promises, and every last lender Bathiani had was calling in the loan at the very same moment. The war was over now, in everything but the paperwork. And so I turned, at last, for home for Vienna, for the peace conference, and the reckoning with a certain banker, and for the one single thing in this entire century that I wanted more than a united Germany, or a rebuilt treasury, or any grand line on any map. I wanted to see my wife. Vienna gave me a homecoming that I had never once earned in the history books, and had spent 6 hard weeks earning in this one. The whole city poured out into the streets. Black and yellow banners hung from every window down every avenue. So many of them the streets themselves looked roofed over in the imperial colors. Church bells rang in every quarter of the city at once, one great overlapping clangor you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. And the people were packed 10 and 12 deep along the whole length of the route, up on the rooftops, hanging clean out of the upper windows, children lifted high onto their fathers' shoulders, all of them singing God Save the Emperor at a volume you only ever hear from a crowd that genuinely, truly believed 1 month ago that it was about to lose absolutely everything it had, and then did not. There is no cheer anywhere on this earth quite like the cheer of people who have been spared. Every soldier lining that road wore the new Brescia medal bright on his chest, and I had given very careful orders that the men marching directly behind me in the very place of highest honor were not to be the generals. They were the ordinary soldiers, the common men, the ones the crowd could look at and recognize as their own sons and their own brothers come home alive. And I rode in at the head of all of it, and I will be honest with you, after 6 straight weeks of trenches and cremation pyres and cold hard arithmetic done on the lives of other men's children, the pure sound of 100,000 people who were simply uncomplicatedly glad got in under every wall I had, past the strategist, straight down to whatever was left of the human being underneath. And I had to work, genuinely work, to keep my face the way an emperor's face is supposed to be in front of his people. And then, at the very end of that long triumphal ride, on the palace steps, in a silver gown, with an armful of white roses held against her, was Alara. Let me give you that one moment properly, and take my time with it, because in the life that I inherited, it never once happened. In that other history, the real Otto came home from this exact war a beaten and broken man, to a wife whose thread he had already long since lost, and they drifted apart from each other across the long gray decades that followed, and it ended, her part of it, in a hotel corridor in Geneva 40 years on, with a sharpened steel file and a lie about feeling perfectly fine. That was the ending that had been sitting there waiting in the book the whole time. Not this ending. This one, I had reached back and rewritten with my own 2 hands. I swung down off the horse before a single aide could move to help me, and I walked up those steps, and I did not care in the very slightest that half the crowned heads and every last newspaperman of Europe stood there watching me do it, and I put my arms around my wife, and I said the only thing there was, in all the wide world, to say, "I'm back, Alara. Welcome home, Otto." And she meant it, and I meant it, and it was real. The whole marriage that the old Otto had fumbled and dropped and lost, rebuilt now, not with pretty apologies, but with the 2 of us having fought the very same war together from opposite ends of it, she in the shadows with her black swan and I out in the freezing mud. We turned together and lifted the white roses up to the roaring crowd, and the sound they made back could have brought down the sky itself. And my mother, the iron woman who had spent years making this exact woman's life a slow and grinding misery, stood off to one side and did the single thing I had never once, in all the borrowed memories crowded into my skull, seen her do. She smiled. The whole poisoned court, healed in a hallway over a telegram about me weeks ago, now stood together in the bright sun and cheered a marriage that in another colder world was already nothing but ash. I had cancelled a funeral. The first of very many still on my list, and by a long, long distance, the one that mattered to me most in either of my lives. I got about one single evening of that before the bill for all the shadow work came due, because the quiet parts of a war do not send a man flowers. Alara told me herself that night, gently, because she understood exactly what it was going to cost me to hear it. Killian was dead. My honest quartermaster general, the commoner the whole empire had been so proud of, the man David had broken through his own dying daughter, had confessed everything, handed over every last thread of the conspiracy, moved his family into the safety of the palace walls, and then, unable to go on living one more day wearing the word traitor, even after he had tried so hard to scrub it clean off himself, he had taken his own life. And he left a note behind that took all of the blame, every scrap of it, onto his own shoulders. He died protecting the truth by drowning it in his own confession. He had never done one single thing against his own conscience in the whole of his life, until a banker set his child's life down on the scale against it, and it had killed him just as surely as any French bullet at Brescia. I sat with that a very long time, alone, Some of the people I could not save in this war were not wearing the enemy's uniform. Some of them were the very best men that I had. And here's the part that took my grief and put a knife's edge on it. Killian's confession should have been more than enough to hang the man who broke him. It was not legally, not in an empire that for all its raw autocracy still held that the law itself was sacred, and David Goldstein was far too careful to have ever left a signature on a single thing that could hang him. My mother authorized a quiet strike on his Vienna mansion regardless, and someone inside my own palace tipped him off. By the time my people arrived, David had already burned every document in the house and vanished, slipped clean out of Vienna and out of the country entirely, gone to his family in Paris, leaving behind him nothing but an empty house and a cold trail. So the banker got away. For the moment. And he believed that made him safe. He had been reading the very same run of 3 straight defeats as everyone else, gloating over them in his private opera box, utterly certain that my broke and cornered government would come crawling to him for a loan at last. He did not yet understand that the defeats had all been theater. That the emperor he had spent months trying to bankrupt was the very same phantom buyer who had cleaned out his entire bond scheme in a single morning. And that a man who has played dead for 6 full weeks just to catch his conspirators leaning too far out over their skis has a very long memory and a very quiet interior ministry and all the time in the world. David had escaped the room. He had not for one instant, escaped the story. And I do not leave my stories unfinished. But first, and I mean this as both a matter of history and as the single act that gave me more pure pleasure than anything else in the whole war, I had to go to a peace conference and redraw the entire map of Europe in front of every king who had ever once made the mistake of underestimating me. Let me start with the coldest thing I did in this whole war and understand that I did it with a warm smile at a polished negotiating table and that nobody bled anywhere that a single soul could see it. I gave Prussia a poison and I dressed it up very prettily as a gift. Prussia was stuck. They had bitten off a chunk of France's border and could not manage to finish chewing it. Their army was a great deal smaller than the whole world believed. Their grab for the German north had stalled out because Britain was propping up little Hanover purely out of spite, and now their foreign minister came to me practically on his knees, begging me to mediate an end to the war and bless their annexations. And I sat there, in the chair of the sitting president of the German Confederation, holding the very treaty we had both signed with its precious little clause about all mergers being strictly voluntary, and I told them no, not Hanover. You may not simply swallow whole a state that does not wish to be swallowed. There are rules to these things, and I happen to be the man appointed to enforce them. And then, while they were still reeling from the refusal, I offered them the poison. Take Alsace and Lorraine, I said, France's 2 border provinces. Take them, as your fair compensation. Have them, with my blessing on them. My own advisors worked out precisely what I had just done about 10 full seconds after the Prussians had left the room, and one of them actually went pale in the face when it landed, because I knew a thing that they were only just beginning to guess at. If Prussia takes Alsace and Lorraine off of France, then France will never, not in 10 years, not in 50, not ever, rest until she has taken them back. I was not handing Prussia a prize at all. I was welding France and Prussia together into permanent, generational, mortal enemies, 2 great powers who would now spend the entire next half a century sharpening their long knives for each other, instead of for me. I had read the book, remember? I knew to the letter exactly what a Franco-Prussian blood grudge over those 2 specific provinces grows itself up into. I knew the war that it starts in 1870, and I knew the very much worse one that it feeds into after that, the one that ate my whole family and my whole empire in the history that I came from. And I sat at that shining table and I planted it, deliberately with my own hands, pointed carefully away from Austria, because if 2 of the strongest men in the room are going to hate somebody for the next 100 years, then an emperor's one and only job is to make very, very certain that it is not himself. That is the thing about knowing the future, the part the storybooks never tell you. You do not simply step around the landmines. If you are ruthless enough, and by that point in the war, God help me, I was ruthless enough, you pick them up one by one, and you carry them very carefully, and you set them back down again underneath somebody else's house. Then Britain arrived to take my measure, in the shape of Lord Granville, the Foreign Secretary, and he came to Vienna at midnight, interrupting the first quiet evening I'd had with Alara in weeks, which did absolutely nothing for my mood, to fence with me over the troops I had sitting down near Nice. Just chasing a few Sardinian stragglers, my lord, I told him, which we both of us knew perfectly well was a lie. And then I did to Lord Granville exactly what I had done to every other man in this whole war. I buried him. Alive in paper. The secret treaty where Mazzini had sold off Nice and Savoy. The hard proof of Louis funding the Hungarian rebels, funding Rossini, sabotaging Austria through his French banks. I let the man read every single page of it, and I made very certain that one document in that stack, which I flipped right past as though entirely by accident, was titled British Government Support for Hungarian Exile Nobles, just so that Lord Granville understood, all the way down, that I knew perfectly well London shelters everybody's revolutionaries too, and that we could either be grown men about all of this together, or the two of us could start opening our files to the daylight, one after another. Then I made a demand so outrageous that it made the man choke on his own breath. 2 billion florins from France, Alsace and Lorraine handed over to the German Confederation, of which I happened to be president, and Sardinia wiped clean off the map of Europe entirely, its king packed off to retire quietly in London. Granville called it a bluff, of course, because it was 1.2, and that is the precise moment that I let him see what it was that I actually wanted, which was so very much stranger and so very much larger than mere money that it took the man a long moment even to parse it. I wanted to abolish an idea. I proposed an international convention with a very boring name and a very sharp edge to it, that geographical names have no bearing whatsoever upon legal sovereignty, that Italy, being merely a word on a map, gives no man alive the right to go conquering in its name. That Germany, being merely a region, grants no one any claim at all to go uniting it by force. In one single clean stroke, it strangled both Italian and German unification by geography right there in the cradle. The two great nationalist wildfires that, in the history I had read cover to cover, burned straight across the next 60 years and remake the entire continent in an ocean of blood. I was proposing, in plain terms, to freeze Europe solid. To rebuild the old, careful, patient balance of power system that a dead chancellor named Metternich had once run, the very one that had kept the peace across the continent for 40 long years after the first Louis fell. And I offered Britain the exact thing that it wanted. In return for signing, I would guarantee Little Hanover's independence. I would even dissolve the German Confederation entirely. I would let Sardinia go on existing as a harmless rump state, all of it, every bit, on one single, unbreakable condition, that the whole world be told, loudly and everywhere, that it had all happened under British pressure, so that no German anywhere alive would ever get to stand up and call me the emperor who had sold out the German nation. Russia had already agreed. The German states had already caved. Lord Granville was the very last holdout in all of Europe, and he was a deeply practical man, and he could see plainly enough that a Europe run jointly by France and Russia was Britain's living nightmare, and that an Austria that had frozen the whole map into place was Britain's fondest and most private dream. He signed. The conference itself opened at Schönbrunn in the Golden Hall, the single grandest gathering of crowned heads that Vienna had seen in living memory, kings and a pope and the foreign ministers of every great power on earth, all come to my palace to help me divide up the continent, which did absolute wonders for Vienna's hotels and even better things for Vienna's wounded pride. And as I was leaving my own family's rooms to walk down to it, two pieces of news reached me at the very same moment. The good one, Budapest was now surrounded, and my field marshal there had been given a free hand to finish it. The bad one struck closer to the bone. Count Széchenyi, a great and gentle Hungarian statesman, one of the very few genuinely loyal to me, whom I had sent to Vienna to rest and recover his health, had, in his despair for the future of his homeland, taken his own life. I ordered that his funeral be paid for out of my own purse, and then I watched my wife do the coldest, cleverest thing I had yet seen her do. Alone, without asking me, Elara quietly gave the order to her newspapers to print that Széchenyi had not died by his own hand at all, but had been assassinated, murdered by Bathiani's own radicals. It was a lie. And it was a perfect one, because it took the death of a beloved moderate and laid it directly at the feet of the rebellion, and turned a private grief into a public weapon against the exact men I most needed the world to hate. "You have fought the good fight, old friend," she is supposed to have said softly over the report. "I will help you walk the path you need to walk." I told you she had become a blade. I did not tell you that she had gotten better at all of it than I was. At the great power table, the real one, where only Austria and Prussia and Russia and Britain and France actually sat, the last shoe finally dropped. Russia, my Russia, seized the whole occasion to simply tear up the old treaty that had kept the Black Sea demilitarized ever since the Crimea, announcing flatly that she would rebuild her fleet and answer to no one about it. And France, bound now by the secret bargain I had helped arrange, stood up and backed her. And Britain sat there, outvoted and furious and isolated, realizing far, far too late just how very many deals had been quietly cut all the way around her in the dark. The map of Europe was being redrawn, clause by clause, and every last line of it had my own fingerprints pressed deep into the ink. And while the kings argued in my golden hall, the last of my enemies who still had an army of his own was learning, in a cellar in Budapest, that his revolution had run entirely out of everything at once. Bathiani's end I will give you straight, without one single joke laid on top of it, because the man earned that much from me. My field marshal in Hungary had run exactly the patient, interlocking, cautious campaign that I had asked him for. No reckless glory charges, no repeat of the disasters of a decade before, just steady, grinding, inexorable pressure, while the reform decrees did far more damage to Batthyani than any cannon ever could. His green conscript army came apart against my veterans. His Romanian allies had already left him hanging in the wind. His own office director had defected and quietly sold me the entire rebel order of battle. And by the middle of August, Budapest was surrounded and starving, and Batthyani had one last choice to make. He chose the old way. He sent his people out to flee, named a successor to carry the cause on, and stayed. He had watched a comrade climb the gallows for this exact cause once before, and he decided that he would far, far rather drink a doctor's painless poison alone in a cellar than be dragged through the streets of Vienna in chains for a mob to jeer at. And his very last loyal soldiers blew that cellar to rubble over him afterward, so that I could never once put his body on public display. Budapest fell on the 18th of August, and the Hungarian rebellion, the second one, was over. And I will say this part plainly, because I am the man who lit the fire that killed him, and I will not stand here and pretend otherwise. Batthyani was a tyrant who built a terror along the banks of the Danube, and Batthyani was also the very last honest believer in a free Hungary, and both of those two things were entirely true at the very same time. And he died with a great deal more dignity than most of the men who sold him out to me ever managed. I had needed him to rise up so that I could crush the whole rotten, tax-dodging noble structure in a single clean legal blow, and it worked. It cost a genuinely brave man his life and a proud old people their rebellion, and I banked that too, the way that I had by now learned to bank every terrible thing, and I turned to the very last name still left on my list. Before I get to him, let me lay the final treaty out flat on the table for you, because it is the whole shape of the new world I built, and every clause of it matters. France ceded Alsace and Lorraine, split now between Prussia and myself, and paid a fortune in reparations besides for the privilege of losing them. Sardinia, poor, betrayed, devoured Sardinia, ceded its alpine border provinces and its great fortress and a mountain of gold, and its beautiful city of Genoa was carved off whole and handed to Rossini as a little republic all his own, which was a gift and was also a cage, but that is very much a story for another day. I annexed the 4 great South German states and Saxony besides, and just like that, the German core of my empire swelled up toward fully half of its entire population. The German Confederation itself was formally dissolved. The whole principle of nationality, that intoxicating, ruinous idea that a people who happen to share a language therefore deserve a state of their very own, was formally, publicly abandoned by all the assembled great powers of Europe, signed away with a pope and a dozen kings as witnesses. Geographical names were declared, in international law, to be legally meaningless, and the old balance of power, the Metternich order, the machine that keeps the peace by keeping everyone a little afraid of everyone else, was born again into the world, with my fingerprints pressed deep into every single clause of the thing. I had woken up 6 weeks before as a man scheduled by history to lose a war and to begin the slow collapse of everything he had ever loved. And I now stood in my own golden hall, and I watched a pope and half the crowned kings of Europe put their names to a piece that I, personally, had written, a piece that froze the entire continent along the exact lines I had drawn on it, that pointed every future war carefully away from my own house and squarely at the enemies I had chosen for it. There is a very particular kind of quiet that you feel standing in a moment like that one. I had stopped the avalanche, and then I had turned the whole thing clean around and sent it roaring back up the mountain, straight at the men who started it. Now, the banker. I had told him, weeks before, when he did not even yet know that the two of us were at war, that if he wished to be a financial emperor, he could go and dream. It was time, at long last, to collect. Here is the ugly truth of how I took down David Goldstein, and I am telling it to you plainly because I promised you at the very start that I would not hide what is in the basement. I could not convict the man honestly, he was simply too careful. The real evidence, Killian's confession, the whole trail of blackmail and smuggled rifles and the run he tried to start on the bank's gold, all of it was true, and not one scrap of it would hold up in a court of law, because a man that rich and that clever never once signs the page that hangs him. So I stopped pretending that it would ever go through a court at all. I had the evidence fabricated, staged photographs, bought statements from paid servants who had never served him a day, and then I skipped the trial entirely and went straight to the one weapon I had learned was more powerful than any judge alive on earth, the newspapers. Every front page in Vienna, overnight, in letters 2 inches high, David Goldstein, French spy, arms smuggler, traitor to the empire. I branded the man, publicly and permanently and forever, with a crime that he mostly had not committed, in order to punish him for the very real crimes that he actually had. and I seized the fortunes of his whole ring, a full dozen great bank shareholders and their allied nobles all together, and I funded the rebuilding of my entire empire with the confiscated gold of the very men who had spent a year trying to bankrupt it. Was it justice? No, it was justice-shaped. It landed on genuinely guilty men for entirely invented reasons, and I would do the exact same thing again tomorrow morning without losing a wink of sleep, and that is precisely the kind of sentence that you ought to be, just a little, afraid of an emperor being able to say out loud. His family in Paris tried to save him. The old patriarch of the whole vast dynasty threw money at a broke and desperate Louis to buy himself leverage, and leaned hard on London and the British Parliament to howl to the heavens about Austria's barbarity, and it bought David nothing at all but a little time, because he had already made his choice, and I will give the old wolf this much, and mean it, he made that choice like a wolf. When it was clearly, finally over, David Goldstein chose to surrender rather than to run, and to go to his death with his back perfectly straight. He scattered his sons out across the great capitals, London and Naples and Paris, spreading the seed wide so that the house itself would survive the felling of its head. And he warned those sons, in the old language of his fathers, of the one single thing that had truly destroyed him. Greed, he told them. Greed is our own enemy and our own trap. Whoever risks everything may lose everything. And then he let my empire take his life and the greater part of his gold, and he went to his sentence without one word of begging, which is, I will freely admit, a great deal more than most of the proud men in this entire long story ever managed at the end. So I won that war too. The quiet one, the one fought in newspaper ink and account ledgers instead of out in the trenches. But you have to understand exactly what it left behind, because it is the hook that drags the whole rest of this story forward into the dark. David Goldstein is dead, and his Vienna house lies broken. But his sons are all still very much alive, scattered now across the 3 single richest capital cities in all of Europe, and they watched an emperor manufacture a lie out of whole cloth to murder their father and rob their family blind, and they will never, ever, as long as any one of them draws breath, forget it. I did not end the war with the Rothschilds. I ended the first battle of it, and I ended it brutally, and I sent the survivors abroad carrying a fresh blood grudge and the very deepest pockets on the entire continent. That bill comes due in a later episode. Those bills always do. I have spent this entire story planting things in other men's gardens, a grudge in Paris, a landmine buried in Alsace, a republic hung like a millstone around Rossini's neck, and a man who plants that much, if he is honest with himself, ought to lie awake some nights wondering which one of them is quietly growing back toward his own door. Some nights I do. And out of the wreckage of the Rothschild ring, I built something the 19th century had genuinely never seen. When the great purge of the trader banks began to bleed, unfairly, into a real and rising fear among Vienna's loyal Jewish financiers, the honest houses, the men who had never once lifted a finger against me, I called the best of them in, personally, and I told them to their faces, plainly, the list of traitors in this empire has every kind of man on it, Christian and Jew and everything in between, and loyalty is the only test that I have ever applied to a single one of them. And then, instead of merely reassuring them, I handed them a revolution to help me build. I took all the seized rebel factories, and rather than simply auctioning them off, I sold them back half privatized, the state keeping 51% of every one, private hands taking 49%, a thing my capitalists had no word for and did not know what to make of. And then I wrote the empire its very first real law protecting the men who actually worked inside those factories, a 10-hour day, and a minimum wage below which no worker could lawfully be paid. And I watched the faces of my industrialists do something genuinely, deeply complicated as it slowly dawned on every last one of them that the emperor who had just publicly executed a dozen of their peers as traitors was the exact same emperor now forcing rights they had never even imagined into the hands of their workers, loyal or utterly ruthless, generous or terrifying, and never, ever once letting a single one of them be entirely certain which of the two he was about to get from me across the table. That, in the end, was the whole trick of it, and I now ran that trick on a continental scale. The peace was signed, the last rebel was dead, the banker was in the ground. And now there was a whole winter in front of me, the winter between the war and the parade I meant to throw at the end of it, and I spent every single day of that winter turning a war chest into an empire. Let me walk you through it quickly, because every one of these is a fuse I lit for the fights that come after this one, and a good storyteller shows you the powder before it ever goes off. I turned my army into a shop. As I re-equipped my own men with the new breech-loading rifles, I gave Russia 50,000 of the old ones. Use them now, my friend, and pay me later, the oldest sales pitch there has ever been. And the Tsar loved them so well that he immediately sent back wanting 100,000 more, and a full ammunition factory besides. And just like that, Austria was an arms exporter with the single biggest customer in all the East already firmly on the hook. And I had one eye fixed the whole time on a far bigger market still, out across the ocean. because I knew, from the book, exactly what was coming. I knew that in about a year, the United States of America was going to tear itself cleanly in half, north against south, in the bloodiest war that continent had ever seen. And I fully intended to be standing right there on the dock with a full catalog open in my hands the very moment it did. There is a dealer named Flick already quietly selling my rifles to the great slaveholders of South Carolina for gold and for cotton, and there are cannon on their way to the separatists of Texas in the hold of a ship called the Nevera, and I am not going to stand here and pretend to you that any of that is clean. I told you at the very start about the basement. This is what is down there. I went hunting for mines, the way that other emperors go hunting for provinces. I founded a foundation and poured a genuine fortune into it, whose only job was to drag the finest mines in all of Europe to Vienna, and some of the names I wrote down on its private list had not yet done one single thing, and would not do one single thing that mattered for years, or even for decades. There is a chemist named Rutherford who is at this very moment perfecting a way to make the new explosive stable enough to actually hold in your hand. I may have quietly handed his people a little nudge in the right direction, and I have offered the man a count's title to come and do it under my roof. There is a great electrical thinker, Hertz, whom I made a baron. There is even on that list a boy. A child named Marconi who will not matter to a single living soul for decades yet, except that I know that he will, someday, matter more than almost any of them, and so I intend to have him. And I reached out and I grabbed my own younger brother by the collar and I kept him home. Because in the history that I read, cover to cover, Leopold sails off across the ocean to play at being the Emperor of Mexico, and he ends his life standing against a wall in front of a Mexican firing squad. And I was not going to bury another brother on another continent, not when a fine naval command in the Adriatic would keep the man alive and breathing and here. I could not save every soul on my long list, but him I could reach. I brought the Catholic Church itself to heel, and I did it with the elegant, patient cruelty that I was by now quite good at. The Pope, terrified of the Italian Republicans closing in on his own papal states, sent an envoy to beg me for my protection, and I, who had once been a devout and dutiful son of the Church, met that envoy with a cold and open ledger. You get, I told him, precisely what you pay for. And what I made him pay was the whole medieval position of the Church inside my empire, its ancient exemption from taxes, its iron grip on the schools, all of it, signed away in exchange for a protection I was in no particular hurry to actually provide, because an empire that lets the altar outrank the throne has already, quietly, begun the long business of losing, and Austria was finished losing. I bound Rossini, too, into running his own little republic down in Genoa, a genuine hero, handed just precisely enough power to keep him busy, and blunt and useful to me, a card to be played against the Pope whenever I should happen to need one. And I dealt at last with my own capitalists, who had one final tantrum left in them. A handful of the great industrialists, furious about the new 10-hour day and the mixed ownership I was forcing down their throats, tried to turn my new labor laws against me. They incited their own deceived workers out into the streets of Vienna on strike, hoping to make the reforms look like chaos. It was a clever move. It was also the very last mistake several of them ever made. I publicized the labor protection law until every worker in the city could recite it. I hunted down the masterminds behind the strike, and I put the most treasonous of the capitalists up against a wall in public, and I fired every official who had dragged his feet. And then I turned to the ones who were left, the ones smart enough to be frightened, and I co-opted them completely. A year's tax exemption, a seat on a new industrial promotion committee, a share in the confiscated factories, civil service examinations thrown open at last to every ethnicity in the empire. I even set up an entire association for the rescue of noblemen, bankrupt but loyal old families, bailed out of their debts by the crown in exchange for a share of their holdings and an oath, so that I would have a loyal, noble industrial base of my very own to set against the disloyal money. Half of them walked out of the room in a fury. The other half understood perfectly that the future had just arrived in Vienna wearing my face, and that their one and only choice was whether to build it with me or to be buried underneath it. Most of them, in the end, chose to build. And then there were the slow fuses, the ones I lit that winter for wars I would very much rather other people fought for me down the years. I threw open the civil service to a great competitive examination, open to every ethnicity in the empire. 140,000 applicants came flooding into Vienna for it. A Ukrainian shepherd's son sitting the very same paper as a baron's, because an empire held together by talent and by hope is a great deal harder to break than one held together by blood and by fear. I began the long, patient work of assimilation, not by the sword, but by the schoolhouse and the pay packet, settling German soldiers on land grants in Hungary and minority soldiers on land in Germany, rewriting the history books, even quietly rebranding the whole idea of German culture as a broader, imperial one that could hold a Slav and a Magyar inside it without choking. And I kept one particular card up my sleeve all winter for a place called Poland, where I could already feel, from the book, an uprising slowly building itself for a few years out, an uprising I fully intended to be ready for from 3 moves away. Every single one of those is a story for another day. That is rather the entire point of lighting a fuse. You get to walk away from it and let it burn down quietly in the dark while you go and do something else. But all of that, the gold and the guns and the geniuses and the long, slow-burning fuses, every last bit of it was the work of the head. The parade that I threw at the very end of that long winter was the one single thing I did with the other part of me, and it was the only hour in the whole of that brutal campaign that cost me nothing at all and felt like absolutely everything. The last day of March, on the great square in front of the palace, I held my victory parade, and I built it wrong, on purpose, in a way that scandalized half my court. A normal imperial parade is a broad and glittering river of noble sons on expensive horses, the whole officer corps arranged like a family portrait of everyone who was already important before the war ever started. I threw all of that straight out. 4 out of every 5 men who marched across that square had earned their place in the line with nothing on this earth but their own blood and their own raw courage. No title standing behind them. No father who had ever mattered to anyone. Just what they themselves had done, at Palestro and at Brescia, and on all the long freezing roads that ran in between. I unveiled a great statue of old Archduke Gustav, the last man before me to beat a Louis on a field of battle, and beneath his bronze I lined up an army that looked, for the first time in its whole long existence, like the actual empire it was raised to defend, every language, every province, every single kind of poor. And then I did the thing I had promised, in the dark, months before, at a campfire, to men who had no idea on earth that they were speaking to their own emperor. I called them forward, by name, the common ones, the ones that the old dead system would have let die anonymous and grateful and utterly forgotten. A shepherd who had become the single finest marksman in the whole army. A father of 7 children who had walked into this war to escape a debt and had walked back out of it. A lieutenant who had arrested a traitor to the empire with his own 2 bare hands. An old sergeant who had told me at that fire with the firelight on his tired face that of course he could believe in an empire without hunger in it because he wanted to so very badly. I called them all up one by one in front of the whole of Vienna, and I made them nobles, not honorary. Not for show, real. Land, and a title, and a name that their own children would carry proudly after them into the next century. And I said the one sentence that I had come 900 miles and 160 years to be able to stand up and say, and to mean all the way down, that nobility does not live in a man's birth, it lives in his soul. And the men who had been told every single day of their entire lives that they were the cheap and the expendable and the forgettable part of this empire, stood there in the pale spring sun, with its oldest and its very highest honor being pinned onto their chests, and the whole square around them simply roared. And I watched a couple of hard old soldiers who had somehow survived the meat grinder put their faces down into their hands and weep. That was the campfire promise, paid. All of it. The land, the food, the empire in which the man who bleeds for it is no longer the man who starves. Not a speech about it. Not a decree. The thing itself, made real, in the open air, with 100,000 living witnesses. Let me leave you where I first started, because I think about it every single time that I stand somewhere like that square. 9 months before, I had opened my eyes and immediately regretted it because the sun was doing its level best to murder me personally, and I was a stranger trapped inside a dead man's body, wearing the face of an emperor whose entire future was a long and carefully catalogued list of funerals, a war he was going to lose, a wife he was going to leave lonely and neglected until an assassin's file finally found her heart, a son, not yet even born, who would one day put a gun to his own head in a hunting lodge, and an empire, circling a drain a full lifetime wide. That was the inheritance. That was the book that I had already read, all the way to its bitter final page. And now I stood on a balcony over a cheering city that had won instead of lost. I had raised up the very men that history had marked down to be ground into the mud. Every king in Europe had put his name to a piece with my own handwriting all over every line of it. And beside me, not off in some separate palace, not corrected and lonely and slowly drifting away into the dark, but right there, close beside me, her hand resting on the stone rail next to my own, was Alara, alive, fierce, her own woman, and mine, and safe. The single funeral on that whole long and terrible list that I would have torn the entire century apart with my bare hands to cancel. And I had cancelled it. She leaned over to me, while the great square below us shouted out both of our names into the spring air, and she asked me quietly what I was thinking. And I did not tell her the truth, because some things a man does not say out loud, not even to her. The truth was that the list was not finished, not by half. The Rothschild sons were out there still, in 3 of the richest cities on the continent, nursing a fresh blood grudge and the deepest pockets in all the world. France and Prussia were already, this very winter, quietly sharpening the long knives that I had personally pressed into their hands. Poland was a slow fuse and America was a fast one, and my own brother still had a standing appointment with a Mexican wall that I was going to have to keep on dragging him bodily away from for years. And somewhere far, far down the years ahead, all the other things that had murdered this family in the other history were still standing there in the shadows, patient and waiting to see whether I had truly changed the story at all or had only bought it a little time, a whole long list of tragedies still left to cancel. Enough work, easily, to fill every last year I had left inside this borrowed body, but all of that was tomorrow's problem. So I looked at my impossible and beautiful and genuinely dangerous wife, and I looked out at my soldiers, wearing the honor that their own blood had finally bought and paid for, and I told her the one part of it that actually mattered, which happened, for once in this entire long story, to be completely and perfectly true. I was thinking, I said, that we are only just getting started.